Hey there, night crew. November 1941. A beat-up little port called Tobruk, roasting on the Libyan coast. 14,000 Australians boxed in. Rommel's tanks on one side, the sea on the other. No heavy guns, barely any water. By every rule of war, these guys should have surrendered weeks ago. Nobody told the Australians that, because German sentries start vanishing in the dark. Dozens of them, between midnight and dawn, not a single shot fired. The few who stumble back are pale and shaking, babbling about shadows rising out of the sand. Spooky? Try being a German guard at 3 a.m. So here's tonight's question. Why did the mighty Wehrmacht lose its mind over Australians, but shrug at the British and Americans? Spoiler, it wasn't the weapons. It was who these men were before the war ever started. But first, drop a comment. What city are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Lights down, let's go. To understand why a few thousand sunburnt men became the recurring nightmare of one of the most feared armies on the planet, you first have to understand the dirt they were standing on. And here is the thing about Tobruk that nobody puts on a postcard. It was not beautiful, it was not comfortable, and absolutely no one was there because they wanted to be. It was a fly-blown little harbour town on the edge of the Libyan desert, the kind of place where the wind never stopped. The flies outnumbered the bullets, and the only thing in generous supply was sand. If you have ever stood in a parking lot in August and thought this is unbearable, congratulations, you have experienced roughly 1% of a Tobruk afternoon, and the heat was honestly the polite part. The real signature of the place was the flies, which arrived in clouds so dense and so relentless that men learned to eat with one hand permanently waving in front of their mouths, a gesture that became so universal it earned its own nickname among the troops. The flies got into the food, into the eyes, into open wounds, into every conceivable place a fly should not be, and they did not take days off. Then there was the dust. Every so often a hot wind would come howling out of the deep desert carrying half of Libya with it, a churning brown wall of grit that blotted out the sun, scoured exposed skin like sandpaper, and worked its way into rifles, engines, rations, and lungs with equal enthusiasm. Visibility would drop to the length of your own arm, and there was nothing to do but wrap a cloth around your face, hunker down, and wait for the world to stop trying to bury you. Naturally, this was also considered a perfectly normal Tuesday. The water situation deserves its own mention, because there was never enough of it, and what there was tasted faintly of whatever it had been stored in, usually petrol drums, which is exactly as appetizing as it sounds. Men were rationed down to a trickle, and learned to make a single canteen perform miracles. So when you imagine the prize everyone was fighting and dying over, do not picture a glittering jewel of the Mediterranean. Picture a sweltering, fly-blown, half-ruined harbour where the drinking water tasted like a gas station. That is what passed for the most coveted address in North Africa. But that miserable little port was, in the cold arithmetic of war, one of the single most valuable pieces of real estate in the entire Mediterranean. Stretch your finger along the North African coast on a map, and you will find a problem that haunted every general who fought there. From Benghazi in the west all the way to Alexandria in the east, a distance of something like 700 miles, there was exactly one harbour deep enough and sheltered enough to unload big ships in real quantities. One, and it was Tobruk. Everywhere else along that coast you were stuck dribbling supplies ashore over open beaches in small boats, which in the middle of a war is about as efficient as trying to fill a swimming pool with a teaspoon. Whoever held Tobruk held the only proper back door for the whole desert campaign, and everybody who knew anything about that war knew it. This matters because deserts are spectacularly bad at feeding armies. A modern mechanized force is a thirsty, hungry, fuel-guzzling monster. Tanks do not run on enthusiasm. Men do not fight on a positive attitude and a stiff upper lip alone. Every shell, every tin of bully beef, every drop of water and every gallon of petrol had to come from somewhere far away, and out here there were no convenient supply depots growing out of the ground. The side that could land its gear close to the front had a colossal advantage. The side that had to drag everything overland for hundreds of miles was, to put it gently, going to have a bad time. It is hard to overstate just how greedy a modern army is once it gets moving. A single tank can drink its own weight in fuel over a few days of hard driving, and a tank with an empty tank is just a very expensive pillbox that cannot turn its turret without help. Artillery devours ammunition at a rate that would make an accountant weep, firing through in an afternoon what took weeks to manufacture and ship. The men themselves needed food, and in that climate, water above all, and water is heavy, and heavy things are exactly what you do not want to be hauling across 1,000 miles of desert track in the baking sun. Add in spare parts, medical supplies, replacement weapons, and the 1,000 other things an army quietly consumes, and you begin to see the shape of the problem. An army at the end of a long supply line is like a swimmer at the far end of a very long breath. It can do impressive things for a while, but the clock is always running, and the further it pushes, the closer it edges toward the moment it simply has to stop and gasp. The genius of holding a forward port was that it shortened that breath dramatically. The curse of losing one was that it stretched it to the snapping point. So the entire war in this corner of the world quietly revolved around a question that sounds almost boring, until you realize lives hung on it. Who controls the ports, and how far does your stuff have to travel before it reaches a man with a rifle? Enter the German commander whose reputation arrived before he did. By the spring of 1941 he had become a household name even among his enemies. The brilliant and frankly infuriating general the British press nicknamed the Desert Fox, a man with a gift for moving faster than anyone expected and showing up exactly where he was least wanted. He had been sent to North Africa with a relatively modest force to stop the Italians from completely collapsing, which on paper was a babysitting job. Instead, he looked at the situation, decided babysitting was beneath him, and went straight on the attack. In a matter of weeks, he flipped the entire front. He came barreling east across the bulge of land called Cyrenaica, sending the British and Commonwealth forces reeling backward in a retreat so rapid and so chaotic that it became known, with the grim humour soldiers reserve for disasters, as a flap. Whole units got tangled up, headquarters got captured, and the carefully drawn front line on the map basically got erased and redrawn a couple 100 miles to the east. The speed of it caught nearly everyone off guard, including, by some accounts, the Fox himself, who had a habit of advancing faster than his own supply officers thought was wise, and then daring the situation to prove him wrong. Commonwealth forces that had recently been winning handily against the Italians suddenly found themselves bundled backward in confusion, vehicles breaking down, columns getting lost, the whole orderly machinery of an army coming apart at high speed. Some units were scooped up wholesale, others scattered, and as the tide rushed east, a decision was taken that would define the next 8 months of the Desert War. Rather than let everyone be swept all the way back toward Egypt, a substantial body of troops was funneled into Tobruk and ordered to hold it, to plant themselves squarely in the path of the advance and refuse to be moved. They were not a hand-picked elite assembled for a glorious mission. They were, to a large degree, the men who happened to be in the right place at a very wrong time, told to dig in and make themselves an enormous nuisance. They proceeded to take that instruction extremely seriously. It was by any measure a stunning run of success. There was just one little splinter the Desert Fox could not pull out of his paw, and its name was Tobruk. As his army surged eastward toward the real prize, Egypt and the Suez Canal beyond it, that one stubborn port refused to fall in line. The Commonwealth troops who had pulled back into it dug in, slammed the gate, and simply declined to leave. And suddenly the Fox had a serious problem sitting right behind his shoulder. Picture the geography for a second, because it is the whole story. Imagine a long coastal road running east and west, the lifeline of the entire German and Italian advance, the artery down which every truckload of fuel and ammunition had to flow if Rommel wanted to keep pushing toward Cairo. Now imagine Tobruk sitting right on that coast, garrisoned, armed, and full of men who were in a notably foul mood. Every time the Fox wanted to send supplies forward to his frontline units, he had two options. He could route everything along the coast road and pray the garrison did not lunge out and cut it, or he could swing his convoys far inland on a long, slow, fuel-burning detour through open desert just to avoid the place. Neither option was good. The fortress was, in the most literal sense, a knife pointed at the back of his supply line. This is the part that trips up a lot of people, because the romantic version of the story imagines a noble garrison making a heroic last stand for the honour of it. That is not what was happening here, and the truth is far more interesting. Tobruk was not being held for glory. It was being held because as long as Commonwealth forces sat inside it, the Desert Fox could not safely advance on Egypt at all. The garrison threatened his flank, gnawed at his supply convoys, and forced him to keep one nervous eye permanently looking over his shoulder. Worse still, because he did not control the harbour, the nearest port he could actually use to land his own supplies was way back to the west, which meant his shells and his petrol had to be hauled an absurd distance overland from Tripoli, sometimes the better part of 1,000 miles before they reached the front. That is the supply equivalent of living in one city and commuting to a job on the other side of the country every single day. Naturally, it was about as sustainable as it sounds. So the fox was faced with an unpleasant truth. He could not simply ignore Tobruk and roll on past it toward Egypt, because leaving a hostile garrison astride his only good road and his only deep-water harbour would have been military suicide. The moment he stretched his forces forward, the men in the fortress could come pouring out and sever everything behind him, stranding his lead units in the desert with no fuel and no shells, which is a fancy way of describing a very expensive and very stationary collection of scrap metal. And he could not capture the place on the run either, because as he was about to learn the hard way, the men inside had no intention of cooperating. That left him with the one option no commander in a hurry ever wants. He had to stop, turn around, and lay siege, and so the ring closed. The defenders had the Mediterranean Sea at their backs to the north, which sounds reassuring until you remember that being able to see the ocean is not the same as being able to leave by it. On the other three sides, the land sides, a German and Italian cordon settled in around them. The perimeter the defenders held was a great curving arc maybe 30 miles long, and they did not have to build it from scratch, which was the one genuinely lucky break in the whole arrangement. The Italians, who had held the town before everything went sideways, had already constructed a defensive belt of concrete strongpoints and dugouts, helpfully spaced out and connected, and the defenders happily moved into this prefabricated misery like tenants inheriting a slightly damp apartment. In front of that line ran belts of barbed wire and, crucially, minefields, sown thickly enough that crossing them in the dark became its own special kind of adventure, one we will be getting to in unpleasant detail later. The defensive belt itself was cleverer than it first appeared, and understanding its layout matters because so much of what followed happened right along it. The outer edge was a line of concrete strongpoints dug into the ground, each one a little cluster of fighting positions and underground shelters connected by tunnels and trenches, sited so that the fire from one post could sweep across the front of its neighbours. In front of all that ran the wire and the minefields, and in places a deep anti-tank ditch carved into the earth to stop armour cold. Behind the forward line sat a second line further back, so that even if attackers punched through the outer belt they would find themselves staring at another wall of guns rather than at open country and a clear road to the harbour. It was, in short, defence in depth, layered and interlocking, the kind of position that looks modest from a distance and turns out to be a meat grinder up close. The defenders settled into this inheritance, improved it where they could, and got busy learning every yard of it in the dark, which would soon prove to be a far more important skill than anyone outside the wire suspected. So that is the trap, and it is worth being honest about who was caught in it and which way. From the outside it looks like a few thousand men bottled up with the enemy at the wire, and the sea at their backs, cut off, surrounded, and doomed. From a wider view it is the opposite. It was the besiegers who were stuck because they could not move forward while the fortress lived, and they could not take the fortress while the defenders fought, and they could not even feed themselves properly because the one good harbour for hundreds of miles was sitting inside the very position they were trying to crack. Tobruk was never really a last stand. It was a cork jammed into the neck of a bottle, and as long as it held, the most celebrated general in the desert was going nowhere fast. It is worth pausing on just how maddening this must have been from the other side of the wire, because it explains a great deal of what was to come. The fox was a man built for movement, for the bold sweeping stroke, for arriving somewhere unexpected before his enemies had finished their morning coffee, and instead he found himself bogged down in precisely the kind of static, grinding, unglamorous siege that his entire style of warfare was designed to avoid. The ground around the fortress did him no favours either. A long low ridge of high ground, an escarpment running roughly parallel to the coast, gave whoever held the right pieces of it a commanding view across the flat, and much of the fighting would come down to who could see whom. For the besiegers, every day the fortress held was a day they were not driving on toward Egypt, a day their supplies kept dribbling in from impossibly far away, a day the prize slipped a little further out of reach. The pressure to crack the place quickly and get on with the real war was enormous, and that pressure, that itch to finish the job and move, was about to lead the besiegers into making exactly the kind of impatient mistakes that the patient men inside the wire were superbly equipped to punish. Which brings us to the men holding the cork in place, and to one of the great miscalculations of the entire campaign. Because if you had asked anyone, on either side, what kind of soldiers were defending that perimeter, the answer you would have received in the spring of 1941 was almost universally dismissive. Nobody, and that includes the people they were fighting for, expected very much from them at all. The core of the garrison was a division of Australians, and the Australian soldier of this era had a reputation that depended very much on who you asked. Among the high command of their own allies, the buttoned-up British officers running the show from comfortable offices in Cairo, the verdict was barely polite. The Australians, they grumbled, were undisciplined colonials. They slouched in formation when they bothered to stand in formation at all. They had an alarming habit of arguing with their officers as though rank were a topic open for friendly debate. They treated the saluting customs that the British Army held so dear with a sort of cheerful contempt, often declining to salute anyone they did not personally respect, which in a strict military culture is roughly the social equivalent of showing up to a black-tie dinner in your underwear. To the spit-and-polish establishment, these men were a scruffy, mouthy, unmanageable embarrassment, and there was a good deal of quiet wishing that they had been sent somewhere else, ideally somewhere far away and preferably quiet. It did not help that, as a nation, Australia was practically a toddler. The country as a unified federation had existed for only about 4 decades, which by the standards of European powers with their centuries of dusty military tradition made it less an ancient martial culture and more a start-up that had wandered into a very serious meeting. The British officer class had inherited a whole architecture of regimental history, ceremony, and rigid hierarchy stretching back generations. The Australians had inherited a continent, a chip on the shoulder, and a deep suspicion of anyone who took himself too seriously. The two worldviews did not so much clash as stare at each other across a canyon of mutual bafflement. There was a deeper reason the Australian temperament rubbed the British establishment the wrong way, and it had to do with where most of these men had come from in life, not just on the map. A great many of them had grown up through the lean, desperate years of the Great Depression, an era that had hammered Australia about as hard as anywhere, throwing huge numbers of working men out of jobs and out onto the road in search of any kind of labour at all. They had ridden the rails, tramped from town to town, taken work where they could find it and gone hungry where they could not. That experience left a mark. It bred a fierce, unsentimental egalitarianism, a bone-deep conviction that a man was worth exactly what he could do and not a penny more, and a corresponding allergy to anyone who expected respect simply because of the title in front of his name. To a culture like that, the elaborate deference of the British class system did not look noble. It looked faintly ridiculous. Why on earth would you salute a man you did not rate, simply because someone had pinned an extra pip on his shoulder? Bound up with all of this was the thing the Australians prized above nearly anything else, a fierce loyalty to the men beside them that they called mateship. It was not a slogan or a poster. It was the genuine, unbreakable bond between men who had decided that the fellow next to you came before rank, before regulation, and often before your own safety. An officer who earned that loyalty by being good at his job and sharing his men's hardships would be followed anywhere. An officer who tried to demand it by waving the rulebook would get exactly nowhere, and would probably be told so to his face in language that would have given a Cairo staff colonel a small stroke. This was the cultural engine humming away underneath the slouching and the back-talk, and it was about to prove worth more than 100 parade grounds. The enemy, for what it is worth, agreed with the snobs. German military intelligence, which prided itself on knowing its opponents, took a look at the Australian division on the books and was distinctly unimpressed. The official assessments filed the 9th Australian Division away under headings that amounted to poorly trained and poorly equipped, a second-string colonial formation unlikely to put up much resistance once the real fighting started. From the German point of view, this was a reasonable guess. These were not gleaming professional regiments with generations of drill behind them. They were volunteers, many of them raised and shipped out in a hurry, lacking in heavy weapons, short on the kind of polished parade ground perfection that European armies used as a proxy for competence. On paper, the file practically wrote itself. These men would not be a problem. This is the part of the story where you should start feeling a little sorry for the German intelligence officers, because they had made a beautiful, logical, perfectly defensible assessment, and it was about to be catastrophically wrong. The problem was not their reasoning. The problem was that they were measuring the wrong thing. They were judging these men by how well they could march in a straight line, and how shiny their boots were, when the relevant question was something nobody in a European staff college had ever thought to ask. What were these men actually good at before anyone handed them a uniform? And the answer to that question is where this whole story turns inside out. Because behind what the generals dismissed as a lack of discipline was not an absence of skill. It was a completely different kind of skill, learned in a completely different kind of school, and it happened to be exactly, almost spookily, the right set of skills for the war they were about to fight. You have to understand where these men came from. This was not an army of city clerks and factory hands, though there were plenty of those too. A remarkable number of them came from the Australian interior, the vast, brutal, sun-hammered expanse the locals simply call the outback, a place so hostile to human life that it makes the Libyan desert look like a garden party with refreshments. Many of them had spent their working lives as drovers, the men who moved enormous herds of cattle and sheep across hundreds of miles of trackless country, sleeping under the stars, finding water where there appeared to be none, and navigating terrain that offered roughly the same number of helpful signposts as the surface of the moon. Others were prospectors, the gold seekers who wandered the bush for months at a stretch with everything they owned on a single animal, surviving on patience and a near-religious tolerance for discomfort. Others still were farmers carved out of marginal land, shearers, fence runners, kangaroo hunters, men who had grown up with a rifle in their hands not as a weapon of war but as the difference between eating and not eating. And the thing about growing up in a place like that is that it teaches you, without you ever quite noticing the lessons, an entire vocabulary of survival that no military academy on Earth could replicate. These men had spent years learning to read country. They could track an animal across bare rock that looked to an untrained eye like nothing at all, picking up a story from a scuffed pebble and a bent blade of grass that the rest of us would walk straight over. They had learned to move quietly, because in the bush, a careless footstep can be the difference between bringing home dinner and watching it bolt over the horizon, and because the things that move loudly in that landscape tend not to last very long. They knew how to navigate by the stars, a skill that comes naturally when the night sky is your only roadmap, and there is not a single light pollution-spewing city for hundreds of miles to drown it out. And, perhaps most importantly of all, they had internalized the rhythm of life in a place that is murderously hot during the day, which meant they understood in their bones that the smart creature does its serious business in the cool dark hours of the night and saves the brutal midday for resting in whatever shade it can find. In the outback, you work when the sun is down and you hide when it is up, or you do not work at all on account of being dead. There were other gifts the bush had quietly handed them too, ones that no recruiting sergeant would have thought to test for. Take patience, the genuine, inhuman patience of a man who has spent days waiting at a waterhole or hours stalking a single wary animal, the ability to stay still and silent long past the point where an ordinary person would fidget, cough, or simply give up. Take improvisation, the habit of mind belonging to people who lived a long way from the nearest shop and had learned to fix, rig, bodge, and make do with whatever was at hand, because the alternative to fixing it yourself was doing without. Take marksmanship, not the formal target shooting of a rifle range, but the practical, economical accuracy of men who had grown up where ammunition cost money and every round had to count, who instinctively understood that you do not waste a shot and you do not miss the one that matters, and take above all a calm and almost casual relationship with discomfort and danger that the average person simply cannot fake. These were men who had been bitten, kicked, sunburned, dehydrated and lost, and had walked it off, and that hard-won composure does not evaporate just because the threat changes from a snake to a sentry. Every one of these traits was forged for survival in an indifferent wilderness, and every single one of them turned out to transfer, almost without translation, into the grim business they now found themselves in. Now hold that image in your mind, and look at where these men suddenly found themselves. North Africa, a landscape of open desert, hard rock, blistering daytime heat, and clear, enormous star-drenched nights. To a British officer fresh from a damp green island, this place was an alien hell, disorienting and hostile and frankly terrifying. To a German soldier raised among forests and tidy fields, it was no better, a featureless waste that played tricks on the eyes and offered nothing familiar to hold on to. But to a man who had spent his life mustering cattle across the Australian interior, the North African desert was not an alien hell at all. It was, of all the unlikely things, almost comforting. It looked like home. The empty ground between the opposing trenches, the stretch of broken, mine-strewn no-man's land that everyone else regarded as a place of pure dread, looked to these men less like a killing field and more like the kind of hunting country they had crossed 1,000 times before. The same instincts that had once told them how to creep up on a wary mob of kangaroos at dawn turned out to translate with very little adjustment into how to creep up on something considerably more dangerous in the dark. This is the great irony sitting at the centre of the whole story, and it is worth letting it land properly. The very qualities that had gotten these men marked down as bad soldiers were the qualities that were about to make them legendary ones. The casual indifference to parade ground ceremony that so offended the British officers was, underneath, the practical self-reliance of men who had spent their lives solving problems alone, with no sergeant to consult and no manual to follow. The habit of arguing with orders was the same independent streak that lets a drover make a life-or-death call about water or weather without waiting for permission from anyone. The refusal to be impressed by rank for its own sake came from a culture where a man was measured by what he could actually do, not by the polish on his boots or the accent in his voice. What the staff officers had filed away as undisciplined was, looked at from a slightly different angle, simply a different and far older form of discipline, the kind enforced not by drill sergeants, but by an unforgiving landscape that killed the careless and rewarded the patient. It is one of the recurring jokes of military history, and not really a funny one if you were on the receiving end, that armies tend to mistake conformity for competence. A man who stands very straight, salutes very crisply, and keeps his uniform immaculate looks like a soldier, and so the system that values appearances rewards him. A man who slouches, talks back, and would rather sleep through the noon parade looks like a problem, and so the system marks him down. But warfare, when it stops being about parades and starts being about killing and surviving, does not care in the slightest how straight you can stand. It cares whether you can find your way across broken ground in the dark without making a sound. It cares whether you can lie motionless in the open for an hour with your heart hammering while danger drifts past a few feet away. It cares whether you can stay calm and think clearly when everything has gone wrong and there is nobody left to give you orders. And on every single one of those measures, the scruffy colonials nobody respected were, it turned out, among the most dangerous men in the entire theatre. Think about what made the German way of fighting so devastating, and you start to see why the dark was its one true weakness. Its whole power came from coordination, from dozens of moving parts acting as one, the tanks and the guns and the infantry and the aircraft all talking to each other and striking together in a single, overwhelming hammer blow. But coordination needs visibility. It needs commanders who can see the battlefield, signals that can be passed, formations that can be kept. Take away the light, and you take away most of that. In the pitch dark, a beautifully drilled formation is just a clump of men who cannot see each other, cannot easily tell friend from foe, and cannot bring their carefully arranged firepower to bear on a target they cannot find. The very machine-like precision that made these troops so formidable in daylight became a liability at night, because a machine with its eyes put out does not adapt well. It was built to deliver a thunderclap, and the war it was now stuck in rewarded a whisper. And a whisper, as it happened, was exactly what the men in the fortress had been perfecting since childhood, though they had spent that childhood whispering up on kangaroos rather than enemy sentries. The skill, unnervingly, was identical, only the quarry had changed. The defenders did not yet know what they had, not in so many words. Nobody had sat down and drawn up a plan that said our secret weapon is that half these blokes used to hunt for a living. But the raw material was there, waiting in the ranks, in the form of a few thousand men who found the desert familiar, found the night comfortable, and found the idea of sitting passively in a trench waiting to be shelled deeply, almost personally, offensive. All it would take to turn that raw material into something genuinely terrifying was the right person to recognize it for what it was, to look at this collection of supposedly hopeless colonials and see, instead of an embarrassment, a pack of natural hunters who had simply been pointed at the wrong prey. But that is a story for the man who was about to do exactly that, and we will get to him soon enough. For now, the picture is set. A miserable little port that the most famous general in the desert could neither take nor leave alone. A ring of wire and mines and concrete closing tight around it. And inside that ring, dismissed by friend and foe alike, underestimated by absolutely everyone with the rank to know better, sat a few thousand men whom the whole world had written off as second-rate, and who were about to demonstrate in the most disconcerting way imaginable that they had been quietly carrying the deadliest skill set in North Africa the entire time. The file said poorly trained and poorly equipped. The file, as the Germans were soon going to discover, had left out the only line that actually mattered. Every collection of raw talent needs someone who can recognize it for what it is, and the man who looked at these supposedly hopeless colonials and saw something the rest of the world had missed was a commander named Leslie Morshead. On paper, he did not look like the sort of figure who would rewrite the rulebook on how to defend a fortress. In civilian life, before the wars came calling, he had been a schoolteacher, a profession not generally associated with leading men through minefields in the dark. But appearances, as we have already established in this story, were doing a tremendous amount of lying, and behind the mild former educator was one of the most quietly ruthless military minds the Desert War would produce. Morshead was not new to any of this. He had worn the uniform once before, a generation earlier, in the First Great War, where he had served through some of the most grinding fighting of that era, and come out the other side with a clear-eyed understanding of what his countrymen were actually like under fire. He had seen them at their best and their worst, watched them ignore orders they thought were stupid, and then perform feats of stubborn courage that left professional soldiers speechless. He had learned, in the hardest possible classroom, a lesson that the staff officers in their comfortable headquarters never quite absorbed. He knew that the Australian soldier was not a tool you operated by pulling levers of rank and regulation. He was a partner you persuaded, a force you pointed rather than pushed, and a man who would walk into the mouth of hell for an officer he respected and would not cross the street for one he did not. Morshead had figured out long before he ever set foot in North Africa that the trick was not to break these men into obedience. The trick was to earn their trust and then turn them loose. Where had this understanding come from? Largely from the unforgiving education of the previous war, fought a generation earlier in the mud and slaughter of the trenches, where Morshead had risen through the ranks the hard way, by surviving and by leading rather than by polish or connection. He had been there for some of the most savage attritional fighting of that era, the kind that ground down divisions and turned green volunteers into hardened veterans, or into casualties, with very little space in between. In that crucible he had watched ordinary Australian men, the same kind of larrikins and backtalkers who so annoyed the establishment, perform under conditions that would have shattered most armies, and he had drawn a permanent conclusion from it. The qualities that made these men difficult to handle in peacetime, the independence, the impatience with pointless authority, the refusal to be cogs in a machine, were the very qualities that made them magnificent when everything fell apart and a man had to think and fight for himself. A great many officers learned the opposite lesson from the same war, deciding that what soldiers needed was more discipline, more control, more rigid obedience. Morshead learned that what these particular soldiers needed was a leader who would harness their nature rather than fight it. It is a rare officer who comes out of a catastrophe with the right lesson instead of the comfortable one, and that rarity is precisely what made him dangerous. That did not mean he was soft. Quite the opposite, and this is where the picture gets interesting. Morshead was a hard man, demanding to the point of severity, with a cold streak and a temper that his soldiers learned to read like weather. He drove them relentlessly, expected absolute commitment, and had no patience whatsoever for slackness or excuses. His men, with the particular affection soldiers reserve for a commander they both fear and admire, gave him a nickname borrowed from a popular villain of the day, a merciless tyrant from the picture houses, and so to the ranks he became Ming the Merciless. It was not entirely a compliment, but it was not entirely an insult either. It was the kind of name you only give a leader you have decided is genuinely formidable, the sort you grumble about endlessly and would follow anywhere. There is a particular flavour of respect that hides inside a nickname like that, and Morshead had earned every syllable of it. Now, what Morshead did with the situation he inherited was, by the standards of conventional military thinking, faintly insane. The textbook approach to defending a besieged fortress was about as old as fortresses themselves and roughly as exciting. You sat inside your defences, you manned your walls, you waited for the enemy to come to you, and when he did, you tried to kill more of him than he killed of you, and then you went back to waiting. It was passive by design, a strategy of endurance, of hunkering down and absorbing punishment and hoping relief arrived before your luck ran out. It was, in essence, a strategy of being a punching bag and trying to be a really durable one. And for most garrisons in most sieges throughout history, it was the only realistic option available, because most garrisons did not have the men or the temperament to do anything bolder. Morshead looked at that textbook, considered it carefully, and decided it was completely wrong for him. His thinking ran in exactly the opposite direction, and it can be summed up in a single radical idea. He decided that the empty, deadly stretch of ground between his perimeter and the enemy lines, the strip of broken earth and wire and mines that every other commander treated as a no-go zone of pure menace, did not belong to the besiegers at all. It belonged to him. It was his territory, and he intended to control it, dominate it, and make it a place where his men moved freely and the enemy moved in terror. Rather than crouch behind his defences waiting to be hit, he resolved to push outward into the darkness every single night, to send his soldiers crawling out beyond the wire to hunt, harass, ambush, and generally make the besiegers feel that the night was not safe for them anywhere within reach of the fortress. The reasoning behind this was not bloodthirst, though it certainly looked alarming from the receiving end. It was psychology, and shrewd psychology at that. Morshead understood something about both his own men and his enemies that the conventional approach ignored entirely. He knew that a garrison that just sits and takes punishment slowly rots from the inside. Morale curdles. Men grow passive and frightened, surrendering the initiative and with it their belief that they can shape their own fate. They begin to feel like prey, and prey eventually behaves like prey. By sending his soldiers out on the attack night after night, Morshead kept them feeling like predators instead, sharp and aggressive and convinced that they owned the dark. And on the other side of the wire the effect was precisely reversed. Every silent raid, every sentry who failed to return, every position that was hit and abandoned by morning chipped away at the besiegers' confidence and planted in them the slow, corrosive dread that the darkness belonged to someone else. You can hold a defensive line against an enemy you can see coming. It is a great deal harder to hold yourself together against an enemy who might already be lying a few feet away in the dark and whom you will never hear until it is far too late. This brings us to the conflict that runs like a live wire through the entire story, the tension between orders and instinct, and Morshead found himself standing right on the fault line of it. The High Command back in the safety of headquarters did not love his approach, not even slightly. From their perspective, the job of a besieged garrison was to survive, to hold the position and stay in one piece, and Morshead's aggressive nightly excursions looked like reckless adventurism that needlessly threw away good men for no clear strategic gain. Telegrams started arriving, increasingly testy ones, expressing displeasure at all these unauthorized operations and requesting, then demanding, that they cease. The men should stay behind the wire. They should stop wandering off into the dark on their private hunting trips. They should, in short, behave like a proper garrison and quit causing trouble. Morshead's response to this stream of disapproval from above became something close to legend, and it tells you everything about the man. He did not argue. He did not write back long indignant justifications or pick a fight with his superiors. He received each telegram with perfect courtesy, nodded gravely, acknowledged the concerns of his betters, filed the message somewhere safe, and then sent another group of his men out the very next night exactly as he had planned all along. It was a masterclass in the ancient art of agreeing with your boss while continuing to do precisely what you intended to do anyway, a skill that anyone who has ever worked in a large organization will recognize with a wince of fellow feeling. He was not being insubordinate for the sake of it. He simply understood his situation, his men and his enemy far better than the distant officers issuing the orders did, and he was not about to surrender the one advantage he had because someone hundreds of miles away found it untidy. It is worth appreciating just how much personal risk Morshead was taking by playing this game, because it was not merely a matter of paperwork and irritated superiors. A commander who repeatedly sets aside the clear wishes of his high command is a commander gambling with his own career, and worse, with the trust placed in him. If his approach had failed, if the casualties had mounted without result, if a string of botched operations had handed the enemy a propaganda gift or weakened the garrison at a critical moment, the telegrams he had so politely set aside would have come back to bury him. He would have been remembered as the reckless colonial general who threw away his men against explicit orders, and history is rarely kind to that man. The conventional, cautious path of sitting tight carried the great advantage that if things went wrong, at least nobody could accuse you of disobedience. Morshead deliberately set that safety net on fire. He staked his reputation, and arguably the survival of the entire garrison, on his own reading of his men and his enemy, against the considered judgment of the people he answered to. That is not the behaviour of a cautious man, and it is certainly not what you would expect from a former schoolteacher. It is the behaviour of someone who has studied a situation, concluded he understands it better than anyone above him, and chosen to live or die by that conviction. The fact that he turned out to be right does not make the gamble any smaller. It just means we remember him as bold rather than foolish, which is the thin and rather arbitrary line that separates the two whenever the story gets told afterward. And his understanding came down to a single, almost stubbornly simple truth about the men under his command. He grasped, in a way the staff officers never could, that you cannot take a wild creature bred for the hunt and train it into a docile show animal that does pretty tricks on command. Australia has a native wild dog, the dingo, a lean and clever predator that ranges across the very country so many of his soldiers had grown up in, and the comparison was almost too perfect. You do not teach a dingo to sit prettily and roll over for a ribbon. Try, and you will get neither a good show dog nor a happy dingo, just a frustrated, miserable animal and a great deal of wasted effort. What you do with a creature like that, if you have any sense at all, is recognise what it was built for and let it loose to do the thing it does better than anything else on Earth. Morshead had a perimeter full of natural hunters who had been mislabelled as bad soldiers because they would not pretend to be something they were not. His genius was not in changing them, it was in refusing to. He stopped trying to file down the very edge that made them dangerous, pointed them at the enemy, and let the hunt begin. So we have arrived at the crucial hinge of the entire story. We have a fortress that the most celebrated commander in the desert could neither take nor abandon. We have a garrison of men whose hard-won wilderness skills made them uniquely suited to fighting in the dark. And now we have the one essential ingredient that ties the first two together, a leader clever enough and bold enough to recognise what he was holding and to use it in a way nobody had authorised and nobody expected. The raw potential and the man who could unlock it had finally met. What remained was the method itself, the actual nuts and bolts of how a handful of men could slip out into the deadliest patch of ground in North Africa, do their grim work and slip back before dawn, night after night, and live to do it again. Because make no mistake, what these men were doing was not a wild improvisation born of reckless courage. It only looked like madness from the outside. Up close, it was one of the most carefully engineered and tightly disciplined forms of fighting anyone had ever devised. Let us take it apart and see how it actually worked, because the precision of it is the thing that turns a good story into a genuinely astonishing one. Start with the size of the raiding parties, which was deliberately, almost surgically small. We are not talking about great waves of men charging across the open ground in the night. A typical patrol was a tight little group of somewhere between 8 and 12 soldiers, and that number was no accident. It was small enough to move in near total silence, small enough that every man could be intimately aware of where the others were without a word being spoken, and small enough to melt back into the dark without leaving a great trampling herd's worth of noise and trace. A larger force would have been louder, slower, easier to detect and far harder to control once the action began. The whole philosophy was built on stealth, and stealth scales terribly. 10 quiet men are an invisible threat. 100 quiet men are a crowd, and crowds, no matter how disciplined, make noise. It also helps to understand that these patrols were not simply about inflicting harm for its own sake, which would have been a waste of extraordinary skill. They served a string of cold, practical purposes that made them worth the enormous risk. The most valuable prize a patrol could bring home was not a position destroyed, but a prisoner taken, because a captured enemy soldier was a walking intelligence report. He could be questioned about which units were facing the perimeter, where the strong points and the weak points lay, what the besiegers were planning, and how their morale was holding up. A single, frightened, talkative prisoner could be worth more than a week of guesswork. Beyond prisoners, the patrols mapped the ground itself, learning where the enemy had laid fresh wire, where new positions had appeared, where the gaps in the gun emplacements were, building up night by night a detailed living picture of the besieging line that no aerial photograph could match. They tested the enemy's reactions, probed his alertness, and kept him permanently uncertain about where the next blow would fall. In short, the raids were reconnaissance with teeth, gathering knowledge and sowing fear in the same outing, and the knowledge was very often the more important harvest of the two. And here is the part that genuinely surprises people. These raids involved no tanks. No artillery softening up the target first. no vehicles of any kind to carry the men forward or haul them back. There was none of the thunderous machinery that everyone associates with modern warfare, none of the support and firepower that a conventional attack would consider absolutely essential. There was just infantry, men on their own 2 feet, moving across the ground under their own power, carrying everything they needed on their bodies. In an age that was rapidly becoming defined by engines and steel and the roar of mechanized war, these men were waging a campaign that would have been entirely recognizable to a hunter from 10,000 years ago. The technology that mattered most out there was not the tank or the field gun. It was the human body, trained to move quietly through the dark, and the human nerve, trained to stay calm while doing it. The weapons they carried tell you almost the entire story of their approach all by themselves. Yes, they brought their rifles, because going into enemy territory completely unarmed in the firearm sense would have been a step too far even for these men. But the rifle was very much a last resort, an emergency tool, something to be used only when everything had already gone sideways and silence was no longer an option. Ammunition was hoarded like the precious thing it was, and a man who fired his rifle on a raid had, in a real sense, already failed at the central objective, which was to remain undetected for as long as humanly possible. Because the moment a single shot rang out in the dark, the whole carefully built advantage evaporated. The flares would go up, the machine guns would open fire blindly into the night, the whole sleeping line would jolt awake, and a silent operation would become a loud and lethal scramble for survival. A gunshot was the sound of the plan dying, so the actual working tools of the trade were the quiet ones, blades and bayonets. Heavy clubs, sometimes fashioned by the men themselves from whatever was at hand, because a soldier who has spent his life improvising tends to keep improvising. And, in one of those details that sounds almost too on the nose to be real, the humble entrenching tool, the short-handled digging shovel that every soldier carried for the dull business of scraping out trenches, which in the hands of a determined man in the dark became something else entirely. These were the implements of close, silent work, the tools you reach for when the entire point is to do what needs doing without making a sound that travels more than a few feet. It was grim, intimate, deeply unglamorous fighting, the absolute opposite of the clean mechanical war of tanks and aircraft, and it relied on getting close, terribly close, to an enemy who had no idea you were there. Timing was its own science, and the men were ruthless about it. The raids were launched in a specific, carefully chosen window, generally somewhere in the deep small hours between 2 and 4 in the morning. This was not a matter of taste or convenience. It was a deliberate exploitation of the rhythms of the human body and the routines of the enemy. Those pre-dawn hours are the cruelest stretch of the night for anyone trying to stay alert. It is the hour when the body's clock bottoms out, when even the most disciplined sentry is fighting a losing battle against his own exhaustion, when the mind drifts and the eyelids grow heavy, and the difference between awake and asleep becomes a blurry, treacherous thing. Anyone who has ever pulled an overnight shift knows the particular fog that descends around 3 in the morning, the way the world seems to slow and thicken, and your own thoughts start moving through syrup. Now imagine being cold, frightened, exhausted, and expected to spot a man who has spent his entire life learning not to be spotted, creeping toward you through ground you cannot see. The raiders chose that hour precisely because it was when their prey was at its weakest. They also timed their approach to coincide with the changing of the enemy guard, those few muddled minutes when one set of tired sentries hands off to another, when attention wavers and the line is at its most distracted. They were, in the most literal sense, attacking the schedule. The moon got a vote in all of this too, and the planners treated it with the seriousness it deserved. A bright moon was the raiders' enemy almost as much as a searchlight, because it washed the desert in a pale glow that stripped away the very darkness the whole method depended on. The most ambitious operations were saved for moonless nights, or for the stretches when the moon had set, when the blackness was deep enough to swallow a crawling man whole. Cloud cover was welcomed like a friend. A still night was prized because sound carried cleanly, and a careless enemy could be heard from far off, though it cut both ways, since the same stillness would betray a clumsy raider just as easily. The men learned to read these conditions the way they had once read weather over open country, factoring the light, the wind, and the temperature into every plane, because out there the sky itself was either an ally or a traitor, and you did not get to choose which by accident. Within each small patrol there was a quiet division of labour that turned a group of individuals into a single functioning organism. Some men were the cutters and the lead crawlers, the ones who went first to find a path through the wire and feel out the ground. Others hung slightly back as cover, ready to lay down fire if everything collapsed and the silent approach turned into a desperate fight. There was usually a navigator whose job was the terrifying responsibility of knowing exactly where they were at every moment in a featureless dark and of getting everyone home again afterward, which was a far harder task than it sounds. Men volunteered for this work, and they were chosen as much for temperament as for skill, because the patrol could only ever be as steady as its least steady member. One man who panicked, who fired too soon, who could not hold still under a flare, could get the entire group killed. So the parties were built carefully out of men who trusted one another completely, who could communicate with a touch on the shoulder or a hand signal barely visible in the gloom, and who had each privately decided that they would rather die than be the one who gave the others away. Then comes the single most important number in the entire method, the one that everything else was built to serve, and it is a matter of distance. The objective was to close the gap to roughly 20 or 30 meters from the enemy position before making any move, and that range was chosen with the precision of a watchmaker. It was a knife-edge balance between two opposite dangers. Get any closer than that, and the risk of being detected during the final approach became unacceptable, because no matter how skilled you are, every additional meter you crawl across an enemy's doorstep is another roll of the dice. But stay any farther back than that, and you created a different and equally fatal problem. From too great a distance you could not cover the open ground and reach the enemy position before the alarm went up, before a sentry's shout or a single shot turned the whole line against you. 20 to 30 meters was the sweet spot, the precise band where you were close enough to strike before the enemy could react, but not so close that you gave yourself away getting there. Finding and holding that distance in pitch darkness, across mined and wired ground, was an art form, and these men had mastered it. Getting to that distance unseen required a whole ritual of preparation that turned ordinary soldiers into something closer to ghosts. Before heading out, the men blacked out their faces with mud or grease or whatever dark material was at hand, because a pale face catches even the faintest light, and a row of pale faces in the dark is a row of little beacons announcing exactly where you are. They went over their gear with obsessive care, hunting down and silencing anything that might make a sound. Belts and straps were wrapped in cloth so the buckles would not clink. Loose equipment was tied down or left behind entirely. Anything metal that might rattle against anything else metal was identified and dealt with, because in the dead silence of the desert night, a single faint clink of gear can carry an astonishing distance, and a single careless jingle can undo an hour of perfect stealth. A common test was for a man to jump up and down before setting out, listening for any telltale sound, the same way a careful hiker today might shake their pack to find the rattling buckle, except that for these men, the consequence of a missed rattle was considerably more serious than a mildly annoying walk. And then there was the discipline that perhaps impresses me most of all, the art of freezing. The besiegers, well aware that something unpleasant kept happening to them in the dark, regularly fired flares up into the night sky, brilliant burning lights that drifted down on small parachutes and turned the black landscape into a stark, shadow-streaked tableau for 30 seconds or a minute at a stretch. For a raiding party caught in the open by one of these flares, the temptation to dive for cover, to scramble, to move, must have been almost overwhelming. But movement is exactly what the human eye is built to catch, even in flickering, uncertain light. A man who moves under a flare might as well be ringing a bell. So the raiders trained themselves to do the hardest thing imaginable in that situation, which was nothing at all. The instant a flare went up, every man froze precisely where he was, holding whatever awkward, half-crouched, agonizing position he happened to be in, becoming for those long seconds just another irregular lump on a landscape full of them. They learned to hold dead still for 10 seconds, 20, however long the light burned, ignoring the cramping muscles and the screaming nerves and the primal urge to run, simply waiting in plain sight until the flare guttered out and the darkness rushed back in to hide them. It is one thing to be brave when you are charging forward. It is something else entirely to be brave by being a rock. And then, after all of it, came the part nobody ever talks about, which was getting home. The journey back was in many ways more dangerous than the journey out, and certainly more nerve-shredding. On the way in, the enemy did not know you were coming. On the way back after a raid had been carried out, the whole line might be awake and jumpy and firing at shadows, and you had to cross that same deadly ground in the opposite direction, often dragging prisoners or wounded comrades, with the night beginning to thin toward a dawn that would strip away your cover entirely. You had to find your way back to the precise gap in your own wire and through the lanes in your own minefield, because getting lost meant either walking onto your own mines or stumbling up to your own perimeter where jittery sentries might shoot you for an attacker. Many a patrol's worst moments came not in the enemy lines at all, but in those final agonizing meters, crawling home exhausted and spent, willing the darkness to last just a little longer. By the time the men slipped back through the wire and the count was taken, they had often been out for hours, every nerve stretched to breaking, every muscle cramped from holding impossible positions, running on nothing but discipline and adrenaline, and the bone-deep refusal to let down the men beside them. Then they would sleep through the brutal heat of the day, and when the sun went down again, a good many of them would do the whole thing over. When you lay all these pieces side by side, the small disciplined parties, the silent weapons, the hoarded ammunition, the surgical timing, the exact attacking distance, the blackened faces and muffled gear and the inhuman stillness under the flares, a clear picture emerges, and it is not the picture of reckless daredevils throwing themselves at the enemy on a wave of bravado. It is the picture of a refined, repeatable, tightly engineered method with strict parameters and very little margin for error. Every element had a reason. Every rule had been paid for, sometimes in blood, and then absorbed into the standard way of doing things. What looked from the German side like some uncanny, almost supernatural ability to appear from nowhere and vanish again was in fact the product of relentless practice and brutal attention to detail, a craft as exacting in its own way as anything taught in a military academy, except that no academy had taught it. The men had brought most of it with them from a life spent hunting in the bush, and Morshead had given them permission to use it. None of it was left to chance or improvised on the spot either. Behind the lines, in the relative safety of the rear areas, patrols rehearsed. They practiced moving together in the dark, refining their hand signals until a whole sequence of intentions could pass down a line of men without a single word. They studied the ground they would cross using whatever sketches and observations earlier patrols had brought back, memorizing landmarks they would have to recognize by feel and silhouette rather than sight. Newer men were paired with veterans who had already been out and come back, so that experience passed down through the ranks the way a craft is handed from a master to an apprentice, by doing rather than by lecture. The standards were merciless, fitting for a commander with that nickname, because a mistake in rehearsal cost a sharp word while the same mistake out beyond the wire could cost everyone their lives. This was the unglamorous engine room beneath the legend, the patient, repetitive grind of practice that turned natural ability into reliable method. The Germans, peering into the dark and seeing men who seemed to materialize out of nowhere with supernatural skill, were in fact watching the results of an enormous amount of deeply ordinary hard work. The next question, of course, is what it actually looked like when one of these patrols crawled out past the wire for the first time and put the whole carefully built method to the test, and that is exactly where we are headed. All of that careful method, all those rules paid for in sweat and rehearsal, meant nothing until the night someone actually crawled out past the wire and put it to the test against a real enemy who fully intended to kill him. So let us go out with one of those first patrols and live it from the inside, because the only way to understand what these men were really doing is to feel the weight of it minute by minute, the way they did. Picture a night in the early days of April, the kind of night the raiders prayed for. There is no moon at all, which is precisely the point. The darkness over the desert is not the soft, friendly dark of a city, where the glow of streetlights always leaves the sky a dull orange. It is the deep, total, almost physical blackness of a place with no lights for 100 miles in any direction. A darkness so complete that a man can hold his own hand a few inches from his face and see nothing whatsoever. To most people, that kind of dark is unnerving, the stuff of childhood nightmares. To the dozen men gathering quietly near the wire tonight, most of them from the cattle country of Queensland, where the nights come down just as heavy and just as empty, it feels less like a threat and more like a familiar blanket. The dark is on their side. They have decided so. 12 of them are going out, all volunteers, because Morshead's whole approach ran on men who chose this work rather than men who were marched into it. Their target sits roughly 400 metres beyond the perimeter, a German observation post, one of those forward positions where the besiegers kept watch over the no man's land and called down artillery on anything that moved by day. 400 metres does not sound like much, You could stroll it in a few unhurried minutes on a pleasant afternoon. Tonight it is going to take the better part of 2 hours, and every single one of those meters has to be earned on the belly, in silence, across ground that has been seeded with mines and wire, and the constant possibility of a flare turning the night to daylight at the worst possible instant. Naturally, nobody is strolling. The men themselves are worth a closer look in these last quiet minutes, because they are not the chiselled action heroes the word commando might bring to mind. They are stockmen and shearers and bushworkers in uniform, lean and weathered, with the unhurried economy of movement that comes from a lifetime of physical work in hard country. Some of them are barely out of their teens, others have grey already creeping into their stubble. What they share is not youth or size, but a particular stillness, a capacity to sit quietly with their own nerves that you cannot teach and cannot fake. There is very little talk before a patrol like this, a few murmured words confirming the plan, a last check of a mate's blackened face and muffled gear, perhaps a grim joke delivered so quietly it barely disturbs the air, because even men like this need to let a little pressure out somehow. Mostly there is just the waiting, that peculiar heavy stretch of time before any dangerous thing begins, when the mind insists on running ahead to all the ways the night could go wrong, and the only cure is to breathe slowly and trust the men beside you. Then the word comes, and the waiting is over, which is its own kind of relief. The faces are blacked out, the gear is muffled and checked again, and there is a last quiet moment at the wire where there is nothing left to do but go. Then they slip through the gap in their own defences and out into the open, and the world contracts to a few feet of sand in front of each man's nose. They move low, flat to the earth, the way you move when being seen means dying. Progress is measured not in strides but in body lengths, each man easing forward a little at a time, feeling the ground ahead with his hands before committing his weight, alert for the telltale shape of a mine or the snag of a tripwire. It is slow, grinding, exhausting work, the kind of sustained physical and mental effort that most of us never experience and would not believe if we did. There is no adrenaline rush here yet, none of the cinematic excitement people imagine. There is only patience, the long, suffocating patience of the hunt stretched out across the dark. The senses, starved of sight, go into overdrive to compensate. With almost nothing to see, a man becomes exquisitely aware of everything else. The faint grit of sand under his palms, the chill of the desert night, which after the murderous heat of the day drops away with startling speed and works its way through a thin uniform until the cold becomes a presence of its own. The smell of the ground, dry and mineral and faintly metallic. The sound of his own breathing, which seems impossibly loud, and the slow, steady thud of his own heart, which seems louder still. Every distant noise becomes a question that has to be answered instantly. Was that a sentry shifting his weight, or just the wind moving over the rocks? Was that scrape one of his own mates, or something on the other side? The mind, with no visual information to anchor it, fills the dark with possibilities, and the discipline these men have built is in large part the discipline of not letting that imagination run away with them. It is a strange, almost meditative state, this slow advance, equal parts physical effort and the relentless management of one's own nerves, and it goes on far longer than any sane person would think a human being could sustain it. Then comes the first flare, and with it the first real test of everything they have trained for. Somewhere ahead a German sentry, bored or nervous or just following orders, fires one up into the sky, and the night detonates into harsh white light. For a sickening second the whole stretch of open ground is laid bare, every rock and ripple of sand thrown into stark relief by the burning glow drifting down beneath its little parachute. And the 12 men, scattered across that suddenly visible ground, do the one thing that goes against every instinct screaming inside them. They freeze. Mid-crawl, in whatever ungainly, half-twisted position they happen to be holding, they simply stop, become stone, and wait. A muscle cramps. The light seems to last forever. The urge to flatten further, to move, to do anything at all, claws at the back of the mind. But movement is what the eye catches, so they give the watching enemy nothing but a landscape of irregular lumps, and they are just 12 more lumps among 1,000. The flare sputters, dims, and dies. The dark slams back down, and after a long-held breath, the slow advance resumes. This happens again and again. Each time the same ritual of becoming nothing. 90 minutes of this. 90 minutes of crawling and freezing and crawling again, with the dew soaking into uniforms and the cold of the desert night settling into joints, already aching from holding impossible poses. And then, gradually, the men at the front become aware that they are close, very close. At around 3 in the morning, deep in the dead hours when the human body is at its lowest and most defenceless ebb, they ease themselves down into the sand roughly 25 metres from the enemy trench and stop. This is the killing distance, the precise band that is close enough to strike before the alarm can spread, and far enough not to have been caught on the approach. And now, lying motionless in the dark at the edge of the enemy position, they begin to gather the small, intimate details that tell them everything. They can hear voices, low, murmured, ordinary, the half-bored conversation of men who believe themselves perfectly safe behind their wire and their mines, passing the long night the way soldiers always have. There is the soft scuff of someone shifting position. And then, in one of those tiny human moments that makes the whole scene suddenly vividly real, a match flares in the dark. Someone in that trench, weary and cold, has decided to light a cigarette, and in doing so has handed the watchers in the sand a perfect little beacon and confirmation of exactly where he is. A moment later the smell drifts across the gap, the unmistakable scent of tobacco smoke, carried on the still night air to men lying flat in the dirt a stone's throw away. The Germans have no idea. To them it is just another quiet, uneventful watch. They are, in the most complete sense, not alone, and they do not know it. Now everything that follows happens in a span of time so short it is almost difficult to believe. The man at the front, the one who has been reading the position, has counted the sentries by their voices and their movements. He raises a hand, and in the faint starlight holds up 3 fingers. 3. With small economical gestures invisible to anyone more than a few feet away, he parcels out the targets among the patrol, each man given his piece of the work without a single word being spoken. There is a pause that must have felt like an eternity, and probably lasted a heartbeat. And then the lead man rises out of the ground, and he runs. What happens next is not a battle in any sense the word usually means. It is a sudden, overwhelming, perfectly silent rush. 12 men erupting from the earth where a second before there had been only empty sand, closing the final meters before the half-asleep defenders can even process what their eyes are telling them. The whole encounter is over in less than 30 seconds. There is no prolonged firefight, no exchange of volleys, none of the drawn-out drama of the movies. By the time the rest of the German line could possibly have grasped that something was wrong, the patrol has done what it came to do and is already gathering itself to leave. With prisoners in tow, men plucked from their own trench in the dark and now being hurried back across no man's land toward a captivity they could never have imagined an hour earlier. The patrol takes losses, a few men wounded in the rush, but every one of them is coming home, and they melt back into the darkness as suddenly as they emerged from it. The return is its own ordeal, the long crawl back through the same gauntlet of wire and mines, now burdened with prisoners and wounded and racing the first grey hint of dawn, but they make it. They come back through the gap in the wire as the sky begins to lighten, filthy, spent, hollow-eyed, and alive, having proven in a single night that the elaborate theory was not theory at all. The prisoners they brought back were, in their own way, as valuable as anything that happened in those 30 violent seconds at the trench. A man snatched from his post in the dark and marched into the fortress arrived in a state of profound disorientation, and disoriented men talk. Night by night those interrogations added up into a remarkably clear picture of the force surrounding them. There was also a quieter benefit that no report ever quite captured. Every prisoner taken was a small, visible humiliation for the besiegers, a man who had simply vanished from his post without a sound, and the knowledge that this kept happening did nothing good for the confidence of those left behind. The raids, in other words, paid out in several currencies at once, and the garrison was learning to bank all of them. It was a weapon, and it worked exactly as designed. The effect inside the fortress was as important as anything that had happened out in the dark, and it spread fast. A patrol coming back at dawn with prisoners in tow and most of its men intact was not just a tactical success, it was a story, and stories travel through a besieged garrison faster than any official report. Word of what the patrol had done passed from dugout to dugout through the day, and with it passed something the garrison badly needed. The simple, electrifying knowledge that they were not merely enduring this siege but winning small, sharp, deeply satisfying victories in it. Men who had been told by half the world that they were second-rate colonials now had hard proof in front of them that they were doing something the vaunted enemy could not match and could barely understand. That kind of knowledge changes how an army carries itself. It puts a swagger back into tired men and turns grim endurance into something closer to grim relish. The hunters had drawn first blood and come home, and every soldier behind that wire stood a little taller for it. The legend that would later spread far beyond the desert was, in that moment, just beginning to take root among the only people whose opinion the raiders actually cared about, which was each other. The reaction from the high command in Cairo was, as you might have predicted by now, less than thrilled. Word of these unauthorized adventures reached headquarters, and the response came crackling back down the wire in the sternest possible terms, an order to cease these operations at once, to stop sending men out beyond the perimeter on these dangerous freelance excursions to behave. And Morshead, true to the form we have already come to know, received the order with grave and perfect courtesy, set it carefully aside with all the others, and arranged for another patrol to go out the following night. The displeasure of distant superiors had not changed the single fact that mattered, which was that the method worked, that it was hurting the enemy out of all proportion to its cost, and that he was not about to stop using the best card in his hand because someone in an air-conditioned office found it alarming. The hunt would go on. And on the other side of the wire, the consequences of that decision were about to start adding up in a way that no German staff officer had planned for. What is striking, reading how the men themselves regarded all this afterward, is how little drama they attached to it. To the raiders, slipping out to dominate the no-man's land was not some grand heroic enterprise. It was a job, an unpleasant and dangerous one, approached with much the same unsentimental practicality they would have brought to mustering cattle or sinking a fence post. They spoke of it, when they spoke of it at all, in flat, understated terms, as a task that needed doing, and that they happened to be good at. There is something almost comic in the gap between how the terrified enemy experienced these raids as visitations by something demonic, and how the men carrying them out experienced them as a long shift of difficult work to be got through before breakfast. That mismatch of perception is one of the quiet themes of the whole story. The thing that loomed in the German imagination as a supernatural horror was, on the Australian side of the wire, just another night, recounted later with a shrug and a dry remark and very little fuss. Men who have spent their lives doing hard things in indifferent country tend not to mistake themselves for legends, even when everyone else has started to. Because here is what happens when you do this not once but night after night, week after week, to the same stretch of enemy line. You do not just inflict losses, you inflict something far more corrosive and far harder to repair, and to understand it, you have to look at the fundamental mismatch between the two sides, the asymmetry that sat at the rotten heart of the whole situation for the besiegers. But that system had trained him for a war of the daylight, and none of it was built for what was being done to him here. He had not been trained to lie awake in a trench at 3 a.m, straining his ears for the sound of a man who has spent his whole life learning to make no sound. He had not been prepared for an enemy who refused to fight the war he had been taught to fight, who came not in formations under the sun but as individuals in the dark, and who treated the deadly no-man's land between the lines as comfortable home ground. He was a master of one game being forced night after night to play a completely different one against opponents who had been playing it since childhood. As covered earlier, the very precision that made the German way of war so formidable in the open became a liability once the light went out, and the besiegers were now living inside that liability every single night. And the maddening thing, from their point of view, was that nothing they tried seemed to fix it. They were not fools, and they responded the way a competent army responds to a problem by reaching for solutions. The trouble was that every solution had a counter, and the men in the dark had already thought of it. They strung more barbed wire, thicker belts of it, to keep the raiders out. The raiders, many of whom had spent their lives cutting and mending fences across enormous properties, simply cut their way through it, quietly and patiently, the way you would deal with any other obstacle in a long day's work. The besiegers brought up searchlights to sweep the open ground and strip away the darkness the raiders depended on. The raiders studied the lights, learned their rhythm, the predictable arc of each sweeping beam, and moved in the pools of shadow between them, timing their advances to the gaps the way you might dash across a road between passing cars. Every technological answer the besiegers reached for assumed an enemy who would behave in a normal, predictable way, and the enemy stubbornly refused to be normal or predictable. In desperation, The besiegers tried to beat the raiders at their own game by sending out patrols of their own, pushing their men into the no-man's land to meet the threat on its own ground. This went about as badly as you might expect when you send students to duel a master. The German patrols, for all the courage of the individual soldiers, were simply not built for this. They moved too loudly, the sound of unaccustomed men crossing difficult ground in the dark carrying clearly to ears trained to listen for exactly that. They tended to bunch up together, drawing close for the very human comfort of not being alone in terrifying darkness, which turned them into a single large target instead of a dispersed and elusive one. And in a detail that would be almost comic if the stakes were not so high, they sometimes used flashlights to find their way, which in the pitch dark is roughly equivalent to wearing a glowing sign that says, "Here I am, please pay attention." A patrol that announces its position with light and noise against an enemy who specializes in finding and exploiting exactly those mistakes is not a patrol, it is a delivery. The raiders heard them coming from hundreds of meters off and dealt with them accordingly, and the lesson the besiegers took from these outings was that going into the dark to find their tormentors only got more of their own men hurt. So the raiders kept the run of the night, and slowly, inevitably, the effect of this began to show up not on maps or in casualty figures alone, but inside the minds of the men on the receiving end. There is a particular kind of fear that comes from facing a threat you cannot see, cannot predict, and cannot reliably defend against, and it is a fear that eats at people from the inside in a way that the honest terror of a daylight battle does not. In an open fight you can at least see your enemy, shoot back, do something. But a man lying in a trench in the small hours, knowing that on any given night, with no warning whatsoever, figures might rise silently out of the ground a few feet away, is a man being slowly hollowed out by dread. He cannot fight what he cannot find. He can only wait, and listen, and imagine, and the imagining is often the worst part of all. It was out of this dread that the besiegers gave the raiders a name, and it is a telling one. They began to speak of the Australians as devils, and the striking thing is that they did not mean it as a mere insult, the way soldiers casually curse any enemy. They meant it almost literally, as the only word that seemed to fit a foe who behaved in ways that felt less than entirely human. Here were enemies who appeared out of nowhere, materializing in the darkness where a moment before there had been nothing, did their terrible work in a matter of seconds, and then vanished again as though the desert itself had swallowed them, leaving behind only the dead, the missing, and the survivors babbling about shapes in the dark. To frightened, exhausted men who could not understand how it was being done, devils was not hyperbole. It was the most accurate description they had. You do not name an enemy that way because you are annoyed with him. You name him that way because some part of you has started to believe he is not playing by the rules of the natural world. A name like that, once it takes hold, develops a life of its own and becomes its own kind of weapon, working for the raiders without their having to lift a finger. Soldiers talk. A man coming off a shift on the haunted sector would carry his stories back to the rear, and the stories grew in the telling the way frightening stories always do, each retelling adding a little to the dread. New units arriving to take their turn on that stretch of line did not come in fresh and confident. They came already primed by the muttered warnings of the men they were relieving, already half convinced before they had spent a single night in the trenches that this was the bad place, the one where the dark itself was against you. Fear, passed mouth to mouth like that, does not need to be accurate to be effective. It only needs to be believed, and a soldier lying tense in a forward trench at 2 a.m, having been told all about the devils by the pale men he replaced, is a soldier whose nerve is already half broken before anything has even happened. The raiders had, without intending to design it, created a reputation that did a good portion of their work for them, softening up each new batch of defenders in advance simply by existing in the imagination of the enemy. And the fear had measurable consequences, the kind that show up in the dull paperwork of an army under strain. Officers commanding companies in the worst affected stretches of the line began, quietly, to seek transfers, to get themselves and their men moved to any other sector, anywhere at all, so long as it was away from the part of the perimeter where the night belonged to someone else. The medical officers noticed something too, a curious pattern in which the number of men reporting sick climbed noticeably in the hours before they were due to take up the dreaded night watches, a phenomenon that any honest doctor could recognize for what it was. Not all of those illnesses were entirely of the body. Fear has a way of expressing itself through aching stomachs and pounding hearts, and a sudden inability to face a duty, and a steady drip of men finding reasons to avoid the night shift is the unmistakable signature of an army whose nerve is being ground down. None of this was cowardice in any simple sense. These were brave men, by and large, perfectly willing to face an honest fight. They were simply being subjected to something their training and their courage had never been designed to withstand. The clearest proof of how badly it was getting to them lies in the special orders that began to circulate for that particular stretch of the front, because armies do not rewrite their standing procedures for minor irritations. The instructions for the sector facing the Australians grew steadily more elaborate and more anxious. Sentries were no longer to stand watch in ones or twos but in threes, on the theory that more eyes and more company might catch the silent visitors, or at least make the men feel less alone in the dark. Flares were to be fired up at frequent regular intervals, every 15 minutes or so through the whole black stretch of the night, in a constant attempt to tear away the darkness the raiders lived in. And the most revealing detail of all is that these extraordinary, resource-draining, sleep-destroying precautions were not applied uniformly along the whole front. They were specific to the sector held by the Australians. The besiegers had in effect formally acknowledged in their own paperwork that this one enemy, on this one stretch of line, was a different and more frightening problem than anyone else they faced, and required a whole separate, costlier, more paranoid way of doing business. There is no higher compliment one army can pay another than to redesign its entire nightly routine around the fear of it. Spare a thought, if you can manage it, for the ordinary German soldier caught in this bind, because his position really was close to impossible. He had done nothing wrong. He was by the standards of his own army well trained, well led, and well equipped, part of a force that had conquered most of a continent. And in return for all that competence he had been posted to a stretch of desert, where the standard advice amounted to stay awake all night, every night, trust nothing, expect that the darkness itself wants you dead, and try to get some rest during the day in roasting heat while flies crawl into your ears. The harder he tried to defend himself, the more exhausted he became, and the more exhausted he became, the more vulnerable he was to the very thing he was exhausting himself to prevent. It was a trap with no clean way out, a problem that punished effort almost as much as carelessness, and it had been built not by some vast superior force, but by a few hundred lightly armed men who simply would not stop coming. By any conventional accounting of the war, the besiegers held every advantage: the numbers, the artillery, the armour, the initiative. And yet on this one stretch of line, in these one set of hours, all of that counted for remarkably little against an enemy who had quietly rewritten the rules of engagement and declined to tell anyone. Which brings us finally to the truth sitting at the centre of all of this, the thing that all the wire and searchlights and tripled sentries and endless flares were really a response to. The besiegers were not, at bottom, afraid of the Australians' weapons. The blades and clubs and rifles were not meaningfully better than anything the Germans themselves carried, and the raiders were if anything more lightly armed than their opponents, deliberately so. What the besiegers had come to fear was something far harder to defend against than any weapon, because it was not a thing at all but a way of thinking. They were afraid of an enemy who simply refused to fight the war the way it was supposed to be fought, who took the rules everyone had agreed on and threw them out, who looked at the deadliest ground on the battlefield and decided to treat it as a hunting range, and who turned the very darkness that frightened everyone else into a weapon all its own. You can build a wall against a weapon. You can train against a tactic. But it is a great deal harder to defend yourself against a mind that has decided calmly and completely not to play your game, and that is exactly the kind of mind the besiegers found themselves up against in the dark every single night. It was not the strength of the hand that frightened them. It was the cold, patient intelligence behind it, the calm refusal to be impressed by their wire or their numbers or their reputation, and there is no field manual anywhere that teaches a soldier how to defend against being outthought. There is a danger in telling this story the way it has just been told, and it is worth stopping to fix it before we go any further, because the danger is that you walk away believing the whole defence of the fortress rested on a few hundred men sneaking around in the dark with blackened faces and entrenching tools. That makes for a wonderful legend, and the legend is true as far as it goes, but it is only half the picture, and frankly it is the more glamorous half. The unglamorous truth is that all the silent night work in the world would not have saved the garrison for a single week if the men could not also do the other thing, the loud, terrifying, broad daylight thing, which was standing their ground when the most feared armoured force in the desert came roaring straight at them, with the explicit intention of crushing the whole position flat. Night raids were the spearhead, the sharp and frightening tip that grabbed all the attention. But a spear is useless without a shaft behind it, and the shaft in this case was a hard core of disciplined daytime defense that almost nobody talks about. So let us talk about it. To understand what happened, you have to climb back inside the head of the commander running the siege, because his thinking drove everything. As we established earlier, he was a man built for speed and movement who had been forced into precisely the slow, grinding situation his entire style of war was designed to avoid, and every day the fortress held was a day he was not driving on toward the real prize. The pressure to crack the place quickly was enormous, and he was not a patient man by nature. So fairly early in the siege, in the middle of April, he decided that enough was enough. He would stop fiddling around the edges and simply do what he did best, which was to punch a hole in the enemy line with concentrated armour and pour through it before the defenders could react. It had worked spectacularly everywhere else. There was no obvious reason it should not work here. He was by all accounts quite confident about the whole thing, which in hindsight is the kind of confidence that history tends to remember with a small, knowing smile. It is worth being precise about why he felt he had to do this at all, rather than simply settling in for a long methodical siege. Time was not on his side, and he knew it. Every week the fortress held was a week his own supplies kept arriving from impossibly far away while the great prize to the east sat untaken, and a commander in that position starts to feel the clock as a physical pressure on the back of his neck. A patient, by-the-book reduction of a fortified position, the kind that grinds the defenders down slowly over months, was a luxury he could not really afford, because every month spent here was a month his enemies further east were using to gather strength and prepare. He needed the place to fall now, not eventually, and so the decision to gamble on a quick, violent armoured stroke was not recklessness for its own sake. It was the logical, almost forced choice of a man who had calculated that a fast success was worth a big risk, because slow failure was the one outcome he genuinely could not tolerate. The trouble with that kind of reasoning, as he was about to learn, is that it works beautifully right up until the moment the enemy declines to cooperate. The assault that followed unfolded across the middle of April, and became known afterward as the Easter Battle, a name that lends it a certain solemn weight, though there was nothing remotely peaceful about it. The plan was a classic of its kind and genuinely well conceived. First, under cover of darkness, German infantry and engineers would force a gap in the perimeter, clearing lanes through the wire and the minefields and seizing a foothold inside the defensive belt. Then, once that breach was open, the tanks would come through in force at first light, fan out behind the defensive line where they could do the most damage, and roll the whole position up from the inside while the defenders were still trying to work out what had hit them. On paper it was elegant. The armour would be loose in the soft rear of the defence, the infantry would be mopping up the strong points, and the fortress would crack open like an egg. The commander had every reason to expect a short, sharp, decisive morning. The first part even went more or less according to plan, which must have been encouraging right up until it was not. In the darkness, the German assault troops did manage to get through the outer defences and establish a foothold inside the perimeter, fighting their way past the forward posts and opening the door for the armour to follow. This is the moment where, in the commander's mental rehearsal, the defence began to collapse. The enemy was through the line. The hard part was supposedly over. All that remained was to send in the tanks and finish the job. And at dawn, that is exactly what he did, sending his armour rumbling forward through the breach and into the body of the fortress, confident that they were entering a broken position full of panicking men. The night work that opened that door deserves a moment of its own, because it was a serious and dangerous piece of soldiering in its own right, and it is easy to forget that the besiegers had brave and skilled men too. Clearing a path through a defended belt of wire and mines in the dark, under the noses of alert defenders, is grim and meticulous work. Engineers had to crawl forward and lift or disarm mines by hand, snip through wire entanglements without making the kind of noise that brings down a storm of fire, and mark out lanes that the following troops and tanks could use, all while knowing that a single mistake meant a sudden and final end. The German assault troops who pushed through and seized that initial foothold inside the perimeter were not bunglers. They did a hard job well, and for a few hours in the dark it genuinely looked as though the plan was unfolding exactly as designed. This matters to the story, because the defeat that followed was not the result of an incompetent enemy stumbling into a trap. It was the result of a skilled enemy doing everything more or less right, and still being undone by defenders who had simply thought one move further ahead. What the tanks were actually entering was a trap, and to appreciate why, you have to understand the single most counterintuitive decision the defenders made, the one that flew in the face of every instinct a soldier has when several tons of enemy steel are bearing down on him. The natural human reaction to a tank attack is to try to stop the tanks as far away as possible, to throw everything you have at them the instant they appear and hold them at the wire. The defenders did almost the opposite. Drawing on a defensive philosophy built around depth rather than a single brittle line, they made the deeply unnerving choice to let the tanks through. The forward defenders held their fire on the armour, lay low in their positions, and allowed the German tanks to grind past them and push on deeper into the perimeter, deliberately opening the door wider rather than slamming it shut. To a man crouched in a slit trench, watching enemy tanks roll directly over and past his position, this must have felt a great deal like surrender, or possibly insanity. It was neither. It was the plan. Try to sit with that experience for a second, because it asks something of the individual soldier that is genuinely hard to overstate. Discipline of the parade ground sort, the standing straight and saluting kind these men had never cared for, is one thing. The discipline required to lie still in a shallow hole in the ground while a multi-ton enemy tank grinds toward you, over you, and past you, and to deliberately not fire, not run, not do anything at all except hold your nerve and wait for your moment, is something else on an entirely different scale. Every animal instinct a human being possesses is screaming at him to react to the enormous metal thing trying to crush him. To override all of that, to let the monster pass and trust the plan, and your mates and your own training, takes a kind of cold courage that has nothing to do with the hot bravery of a charge. It is the bravery of restraint, of doing nothing well, and it is far rarer and far harder than it looks. That the forward defenders managed it, position after position, all along the breach, is one of the quietly astonishing facts of the whole battle, and it was the hinge on which everything else turned, because the whole brutal logic of the thing rested on a simple truth about tanks that the defenders understood and were about to demonstrate in the most emphatic way possible. A tank is a magnificent and frightening machine, but it is also, in important ways, a blind and vulnerable one, especially when it is operating alone. Buttoned up and moving, a tank crew can see remarkably little of the world around them. They depend on their accompanying infantry to be their eyes, to spot the hidden anti-tank gun, to clear the troublesome trench, to protect their flanks and their vulnerable rear from the men who would happily creep up close and disable them. Take that infantry away, and a tank goes from a combined arms hammer to a deaf, half-blind metal box wandering around hostile territory with a target painted on it. And separating the tanks from their infantry was precisely, surgically, what the defenders had set out to do. As the German armour pushed deeper into the perimeter, the defenders who had let it pass now rose up behind it and turned the full weight of their fire not on the tanks, which they largely ignored for the moment, but on the infantry following along behind. With machine guns, rifles, and everything else they had, they hammered the foot soldiers and pinned them down, cutting them off from the armour they were supposed to be protecting. The result was that the tanks rolled on into the heart of the fortress, while their essential infantry support was left stranded and suppressed behind them, unable to keep up. In the space of a few violent minutes, the elegant combined arms assault came apart at the seams, neatly divided into two helpless halves. The infantry was stuck outside, taking a beating and going nowhere, and the tanks were now deep inside the position, alone, blind, and about to discover that the soft rear they had been promised was nothing of the sort. None of this came cheaply for the defenders, and it would be a disservice to make it sound clean or easy. Splitting an armoured assault apart means standing your ground in the middle of it, and the men who held the forward positions and then rose to cut off the German infantry did so in vicious close fighting at short range, with the outcome genuinely in doubt for stretches of that long morning. Positions were overrun and then retaken. Small groups of defenders found themselves fighting in isolation, cut off and surrounded, holding on by sheer stubbornness until the larger picture swung back in their favour. There were acts of individual courage in that breach of the kind that armies remember for generations, men who charged into impossible situations to plug a gap or knock out a threatening position, and who paid the highest price for it, buying with their lives the time their comrades needed. The repulse of the assault was a collective achievement built on the back of a great many individual ones, and the price of it was real. It is easy, telling the story from a comfortable distance, to reduce it to a clever tactical diagram. The tanks let through here, the infantry cut off there. For the men living inside that diagram, it was the longest morning of their lives, and not all of them saw the end of it. What the German armour found waiting for it instead of a collapsing defence was a carefully prepared killing ground. The defenders had not built a single thin line and hoped for the best. As touched on when we walked the perimeter earlier, the defence ran in depth, with a second line of positions well back from the first, and tucked into that depth was the real teeth of the anti-tank defence. There were anti-tank guns, sighted and concealed and waiting, holding their fire until the tanks had committed themselves fully and could not easily back out. There was field artillery, much of it positioned where it could engage the armour at brutally close range, and there was the terrain itself, including the deep anti-tank ditch that had been carved into the ground to funnel and trap armour exactly like this. The tanks, having charged confidently into what they believed was a beaten enemy, suddenly found themselves taking fire from multiple directions at once, with no friendly infantry to shield them and no clear way through. The hunters of the open desert had, for one day, become something else entirely, the patient ambushes of a heavily armed killing zone. The defence that closed around those tanks was not one weapon, but a layered web of them, each covering the other's weaknesses. The anti-tank guns were the backbone, sighted to catch the armour from the flank where its protection was thinnest, because even in this era a tank's armour was always heaviest at the front, and an enemy who shot you in the side or the rear was an enemy to be feared. But around and behind those guns sat everything else the defenders could bring to bear. There were the field guns, including the improvised crews we will come to in a moment. There were infantry close assault teams, men prepared to do the genuinely hair-raising work of getting in tight against a tank that had lost its protective infantry escort, exploiting the simple fact that a tank crew sealed inside their machine can see almost nothing of what is happening right beside their tracks. And there was the ground itself, the ditch and the broken terrain channeling the armour into the places where the guns were waiting. A single anti-tank gun against a mass of tanks is a brief and one-sided story, but anti-tank guns and field artillery and close assault infantry and prepared terrain, all working together against tanks that had been stripped of their own infantry, is a recipe for exactly the kind of methodical destruction that unfolded that morning. The Germans had brought a combined arms attack and had it taken apart. The defenders answered with a combined arms defence and made it stick. The artillery in particular did work that day that deserves a moment of genuine respect, because firing at tanks is not the same as the gentle, distant lobbing of shells that the word artillery usually conjures. Stopping a charging tank often meant engaging it over open sights, which is the artilleryman's term for the deeply alarming business of lowering the gun barrel until you are aiming directly at the target in front of you, like a colossal rifle, and firing at it across open ground at point-blank range. This is not a comfortable way to fight. It means the tank can see you just as clearly as you can see it, and the contest comes down to who fires accurately first. The gun crews stood to their pieces and slugged it out with the German armour at distances where a miss was as good as a death sentence, and they did it with a steadiness that turned the deep position into a graveyard for tanks. One by one the German machines were knocked out, immobilised, or set ablaze, and the survivors, finding themselves alone, surrounded, low on the support they needed and steadily losing comrades, were left with no good options at all. The whole grand assault, the elegant plan that was supposed to crack the fortress open in a single morning, simply ran out of momentum and died. The tanks that could still move pulled back the way they had come, abandoning the attack, and the infantry that had been pinned outside got no further. The commander who had been so confident at dawn was, by the time the dust settled, looking at a sharp and humiliating repulse, a meaningful chunk of his precious armour wrecked or disabled, and a fortress that was somehow still very much in business. It was a genuine shock to a force that had grown accustomed to its tanks simply rolling over whatever stood in their way, and it sent a message that rippled well beyond this one battle. For the celebrated commander, this was something he had not tasted much of in the desert up to that point, which was a clear, hard, unambiguous defeat. He had been outrunning and outwitting his opponents for weeks, and now a force he had written off as a trapped and demoralised garrison had stood up, taken his best armoured punch, and knocked it flat. The loss of the tanks themselves was painful enough, since armour was precious and could not be easily replaced at the end of that absurdly long supply line. But the deeper damage was to the assumption underneath everything, the assumption that this fortress was a problem that could be solved quickly, with enough force and enough confidence. That assumption was now in ruins. He would try other approaches in the weeks that followed, probing and pressing and looking for a weak point. But the great gamble of a swift armoured breakthrough had failed, and with it went his best hope of taking the place in a hurry. The fortress had not merely survived, it had taught the most feared general in the theatre that the rules he was used to did not apply here, which is a lesson that tends to stick in a commander's mind and quietly poison his confidence for a long time afterward. The defenders had proven that they could do far more than prowl around in the dark, unsettling sentries. They could stand in the open, in daylight, and break the back of a determined armoured assault delivered by one of the best tank forces in the world. The fortress was not just an annoyance that bit at the edges. It was a hard nut that had just cracked several very expensive teeth. And now we come to the detail in all of this that is so wonderfully, improbably characteristic of these men that it almost sounds invented, except that it is entirely real. Part of the firepower that helped break that assault, and that kept the besiegers honest throughout the long months that followed, came from a source that no proper army would ever have planned for. When the previous defenders of the town had been swept away in the Great Collapse, they had left behind a considerable quantity of military hardware, the way a retreating army always does, and among the abandoned equipment was a useful number of field guns, perfectly serviceable artillery pieces simply sitting there waiting for someone to make use of them. There was, however, one small problem, which was that the men of the garrison who came across these guns were by and large infantry. They were riflemen, stockmen with rifles, hunters with rifles, not trained gunners. Nobody had ever taught them the genuinely complex science of artillery, the mathematics of trajectories and elevations, and the careful calculations that turn a big gun into an accurate weapon rather than an expensive way of redistributing sand. A more sensible and better disciplined army might have looked at those abandoned guns, noted that nobody present knew how to use them properly, and left them alone. These men, being neither especially sensible nor especially fond of leaving useful things lying around, did the opposite. They adopted the guns, they figured them out. With no manuals, no instructors, and no formal training whatsoever, they crewed those captured pieces and taught themselves to fire them through the time-honoured method of trying it, and seeing what happened, then adjusting. It was artillery by trial and error. Gunnery learned the way they had learned everything else in their hard, self-reliant lives, by getting their hands on the thing and refusing to be beaten by it. They worked out roughly where the shells were landing, corrected by eye, and gradually became, if not textbook gunners, then certainly gunners who could put a shell somewhere broadly useful, which in the heat of a defensive battle turned out to be more than good enough. Their accuracy was, let us say, more enthusiastic than precise, at least at first, but enthusiasm delivered in the form of high explosive shells has a way of commanding respect regardless. The practical details of how they managed it are a small comedy all their own. With nobody to teach them the proper procedures, they improvised an entire system of gunnery out of common sense and observation. Someone would watch where the shells were landing, shout corrections back to the gun, and the crew would nudge the barrel a little this way or that and try again, gradually walking their fire toward the target by pure trial and error, like a man adjusting the aim of a garden hose. They scrounged ammunition wherever they could find it, sometimes from the same abandoned stocks the guns had come from, and they were not always entirely certain what each type of shell was supposed to do until they fired one and found out. There is a particular flavour of cheerful recklessness in the idea of infantrymen loosing off captured artillery they only half understood in the rough direction of the enemy, and gradually getting the hang of it through sheer persistence. It should not have worked nearly as well as it did, but the besiegers quickly learned that shells were arriving from positions where no proper artillery had any business being, fired by men who by every rule should not have known one end of the gun from the other, and the psychological effect of that unpredictability was worth almost as much as the shells themselves. An enemy who keeps being surprised is an enemy who is never quite able to relax, and surprise was something this garrison specialised in regardless of whether the sun was up. It is worth noting too that the men who took up those orphaned guns kept right on doing their other jobs around them. A soldier might spend the day learning the dark arts of self-taught gunnery, and still be expected to do his share of the ordinary exhausting work of the perimeter, which tells you something about both the manpower pressures of a siege and the bottomless adaptability of men who had spent their lives being expected to turn their hand to whatever needed doing. The garrison, with the dry wit these men brought to everything, gave this improvised outfit a perfect name. They called it the Bush Artillery, a label that captured the whole glorious absurdity of it. Infantrymen from the back country teaching themselves to work field guns by instinct and stubbornness, the same way their kind had always made do with whatever tools the situation handed them. The name was half a joke and half a badge of honour, which is exactly the register these men tended to operate in. And while the Bush Artillery was never going to be mistaken for a precision instrument, it added real weight to the defence, gave the besiegers yet another unpleasant surprise to factor in, and stood as a perfect emblem of the whole garrison's approach to the war. Faced with a problem and a pile of abandoned guns, they did not wait for permission or for proper training. They simply got on with it, on the reasonable theory that a gun fired imperfectly by a determined amateur is considerably more useful than a gun fired by nobody at all. There is something deeply revealing in that little episode, and it ties directly back to everything we have learned about who these men were. The same qualities that made them such natural night raiders, the self-reliance, the improvisation, the refusal to be intimidated by a task they had no business attempting, the comfort with making do and figuring it out as they went, were exactly the qualities on display when they taught themselves artillery from scratch in the middle of a siege. It was the bush mentality applied to a field gun instead of a rifle or a fence line. Where a more conventional soldier might have seen an abandoned cannon as someone else's specialist equipment, none of his business, these men saw a tool, and tools were for using. That instinct, multiplied across thousands of men and 1,000 small problems, was a quiet but enormous part of why the fortress held. It is also worth remembering that the great set-piece battles, dramatic as they were, made up only a small fraction of what holding the line actually meant. Between the big assaults stretched long weeks of something far less cinematic, and in its own way just as wearing, the daily grind of simply existing as a target. The besiegers shelled the perimeter and the harbour with grim regularity, so that sudden death could arrive at any hour from a sky the defenders could not control, and there was very little anyone could do about it except dig deeper and develop the fatalistic calm that frontline soldiers everywhere eventually acquire. Men held their positions through the murderous heat of the day and the cold of the night, repaired their defences under fire, stood their watches, and endured the slow erosion of constant danger and constant discomfort, all while the rations stayed monotonous, and the water stayed scarce, and the flies, as ever, declined to take any interest in the strategic situation. This was the true texture of the siege, the unspectacular endurance that filled the spaces between the moments history records. The armoured assault that was broken in a single morning is the part that gets remembered, but it sat on top of months of patient, unglamorous holding on, and the one would have meant nothing without the other. A fortress is not held only on the days of great battles. It is held on all the ordinary terrible days in between, by men too stubborn to give up ground they had decided was theirs. Step back and look at the full shape of what the defence had become, and the real lesson of this battle comes into focus. The garrison was not a one-trick force, however brilliant that one trick was. By day, it could absorb and shatter a concentrated armoured assault delivered by an enemy who had grown used to winning, using disciplined defence in depth, well-handled anti-tank guns, professional artillery, and a crew of self-taught amateurs banging away with captured cannon. By night, as we have seen, it owned the darkness and turned the besiegers' slumber into a slow torment. These were not two separate stories. They were two faces of the same thing, the same men, the same temperament, the same refusal to behave the way they were supposed to, simply expressed in different ways depending on whether the sun was up. What makes the daytime achievement especially striking is that the defensive method behind it was, for its moment, genuinely forward-thinking. In an era when a great many armies still instinctively believed the right way to stop a tank attack was to meet it head-on at the front line with everything you had, the choice to absorb the blow, let the armour penetrate, and then dismember the attack from within was a sophisticated idea that not every professional staff had fully grasped. It required confidence, careful preparation, and nerves of iron from the men asked to carry it out, and it depended on understanding the enemy's combined arms attack well enough to know precisely which thread to pull to make the whole thing unravel. That a force the world had dismissed as poorly trained colonials executed this kind of defence successfully against the very army that had practically invented modern armoured warfare is one of those facts that ought to permanently retire the idea that Polish and competence are the same thing. The lessons of how to defeat armour with depth, with the separation of tanks from their infantry, and with interlocking fields of anti-tank fire, would be studied and refined by others for years afterward. But on this particular morning, a group of self-reliant amateurs had worked a great deal of it out for themselves under fire, which is the hardest possible classroom in which to learn anything. The night raids got the legend and the nickname and the whispered fear, and they earned every bit of it. But underneath that glittering edge sat the thing that actually made survival possible. A solid, stubborn, occasionally improvised backbone of conventional defense that could take the heaviest blow the enemy could throw and remain standing. So the next time the image comes to mind of shadows rising silently out of the desert sand, it is worth holding alongside it this other, louder image from the broad light of day, of gun crews standing firm as tanks bore down on them, of infantry deliberately letting armour roll past so they could trap it, of self-taught bushmen working captured guns by guesswork and grit. The fortress was not held by glamour. It was held by the unglamorous willingness to stand in the open and take the worst the enemy had, and then hand it back. The spear had a frightening point, but it also had a shaft of seasoned timber, and it was the whole spear together, point and shaft, that the besiegers could neither break nor pull out of their side. With the great armoured gamble beaten back and the perimeter still firmly in the garrison's hands, the siege settled into its long grinding rhythm, and the question of how a surrounded force could keep fighting at all, month after month, with the enemy at the wire and the sea at its back, becomes the next thing worth understanding. Because an army, however brave and however clever, does not run on courage alone. It runs on bullets and bread and water and fuel, and every one of those things had to come from somewhere. Across a sea swarming with enemy aircraft, into a harbour the besiegers were doing their level best to render unusable. How that lifeline was kept open, and who paid the price to keep it flowing, turns out to be a story every bit as remarkable as anything that happened out beyond the wire. Before we follow the lifeline out to sea, there is one more night out beyond the wire that has to be told, because if the silent raids were the sharpest edge of this whole story, then this was the night that edge cut deepest. Everything the garrison had learned about owning the dark, every rule of the method paid for over weeks of patient practice, came together in a single operation that did more in a few hours than weeks of conventional fighting could have managed. It is the raid that, in the memory of the men who were there, changed the whole character of the siege. The trouble that set it in motion was fittingly a problem of supply, the very thing that governed everything in this campaign. Inside the perimeter, the garrison had to move its own men and material around constantly, shifting supplies up to the forward positions and bringing the wounded and the worn-out back, and a great deal of that movement happened by truck along the rough tracks inside the fortress. Now, the besiegers had taken a particular piece of high ground out beyond the line and turned it into a fortified observation post, and from that elevated perch their observers had a clear view across a stretch of the interior where those vehicles had to run. An observer on high ground with a working radio is one of the most dangerous things on a battlefield because he does not have to hit anything himself. He simply watches, picks up the telephone or the radio, and calls down the fire of distant guns onto whatever he sees moving. And what he saw moving day after day were the garrison supply trucks. The results were exactly as grim as you would expect. Vehicle after vehicle was caught in the open and destroyed, picked off by artillery fire directed from that vantage point with infuriating accuracy. Dozens of trucks had already been lost, along with their precious cargoes and, far worse, their crews, and every loss tightened the screws on a garrison that could not easily replace any of it. This was not a minor irritation. It was a slow bleed, a steady drain on the fortress's ability to keep itself supplied and functioning, and as long as that observation post sat up there with its commanding view, the bleeding would continue. The post had to go. The only question was how. What made the post so maddening was the particular cruelty of how artillery spotting works, because the men dying to it never got to fight back against anyone they could see. The danger was not the observer himself, perched far away on his hill with a pair of field glasses and a radio. The danger was the guns he commanded, batteries positioned well to the rear, out of sight and out of reach, lobbing their shells over the horizon onto coordinates the observer fed them. A truck driver grinding along an exposed track had no enemy to shoot at, no position to charge, no way to make the threat stop. He simply drove and watched the ground around him and hoped, while somewhere up on that height, a calm voice was reading off his position to men he would never lay eyes on. There is something especially demoralizing about death that arrives that way, impersonally, from an enemy you cannot touch. and the garrison knew that as long as the eye on the hill kept watching, no amount of courage behind the wheel would change the odds. You cannot dodge a problem like that. You can only put out the eye. This is where the old argument flared up again, the one that had been simmering since the very first patrol slipped through the wire, the eternal tension between the conventional way of doing things and the way the garrison's commander preferred. The higher staff, looking at the problem through the lens of standard military doctrine, favoured the textbook solution. You took a fortified enemy position by mounting a proper deliberate assault, which meant first softening up the target with a heavy artillery bombardment to smash the defences and stun the defenders, and then sending infantry forward to take the ground while the enemy was still reeling. It was the accepted method, taught in every staff college, and against many targets it was the right one. But Morshead, who by now had earned the right to be listened to even by people who found him exasperating, looked at this particular problem and said no. His objection was not stubbornness for its own sake. He understood something about this specific target that the textbook solution ignored entirely. A heavy bombardment, for all its destructive power, has one enormous drawback as a prelude to an attack, which is that it tells the enemy exactly what is about to happen. The moment your guns open up on a position, every defender in it knows an assault is coming, grabs his weapon and braces for it. You trade away the single most valuable thing an attacker can possess, which is surprise, in exchange for a few minutes of bombardment that a well-dug-in defender can often ride out in his shelter and emerge from ready to fight. Worse, the bombardment churns up the ground, fills the air with smoke and confusion, and announces the precise location of the attack to every enemy unit within earshot, inviting reinforcements and counterfire. For a strong point manned by alert defenders behind good cover, a noisy advertised assault might cost a great many men for an uncertain result. Morshead did not want to advertise. He wanted to do the opposite of advertise. He wanted the defenders of that post to have no idea anything was wrong until it was far too late to matter, and so, instead of the guns, he sent the hunters. You can understand why the staff found this frustrating, even if history has sided with Morshead. From their perspective, he was once again declining the safe, proven, by-the-book method, in favour of something that depended entirely on a small group of men pulling off a feat of skill in the dark, with no fallback if it went wrong. A bombardment was reliable in the sense that you knew exactly what it would do, even if what it did was sometimes not enough. A silent assault by raiders was a higher risk, higher reward proposition, brilliant if it worked, and a potential disaster if the approach was detected halfway across no man's land. The staff were not foolish to prefer the predictable option, and in many situations they would have been right. But Morshead had something they lacked, which was an intimate, hard-won understanding of exactly what his men could do, and he had watched them prove it night after night. He was not gambling blind. He was betting on a capability he had personally seen demonstrated over and over, and he judged correctly, as it turned out, that surprise delivered by skilled men was worth more than firepower delivered with advance warning. It was the same argument that had run through the whole siege, simply playing out at higher stakes than ever before. The operation he authorized was, by the standards of the raids we have already seen, enormous. The patrols that had been unsettling the besiegers night after night were small, tight groups of a handful of men, deliberately kept that way because silence does not scale. This time the plan called for something far more ambitious, a raiding force of around 40 men, several times the size of a normal patrol, tasked not with hitting and slipping away but with taking and clearing an entire fortified position. Scaling the method up to that size was a genuine gamble, and it is worth pausing on why. Everything that made the small patrols work, the near-total silence, the invisibility, the ability to move as a single quiet organism, gets exponentially harder as you add men. 40 men make far more noise than 8. 40 men are far harder to keep together and control in the dark. 40 men crossing dangerous ground multiply by 5 the number of chances for someone to make the one small mistake that brings the whole night crashing down. Pulling off a silent approach with a force that size was asking the method to do something it had never been built for, and it would demand a level of discipline from every single man involved that left no room at all for error. The way they managed it was to bring organisation to bear without sacrificing stealth, which is a harder balance than it sounds. A force of 40 could not move as one undifferentiated clump, so it was broken down into smaller elements, each with its own task and its own leader, so that control could be exercised through a handful of men rather than shouted across the whole group. Some would deal with the approach and the breaching of the position, others would clear specific parts of it once inside, and others still would handle the prisoners and the hall and cover the withdrawal. Every man had to know not just the plan, but his own precise part in it, because once the action started, there would be no opportunity to stop and explain anything. The communication that held it all together was the same near-silent language of touch and gesture, and prearranged signal that the small patrols had perfected, now stretched to coordinate 5 times as many men. It demanded that each soldier carry the whole shape of the operation in his head, and trust that everyone around him was doing the same. This was not a wild charge of 40 individuals. It was a single, carefully rehearsed machine that happened to be made of men, and the fact that it functioned at all in the dark, in silence, on dangerous ground, is a quiet testament to how far the garrison had refined its craft. The night chosen was the one running into the 22nd of April, and the approach to the target was where the real ordeal lay, because between the raiders and the enemy post stretched a minefield. We have talked before about the general menace of these belts of buried explosives, but it is one thing to know a minefield is dangerous in the abstract, and quite another to cross one in the dark, in silence, with 40 men, knowing that a single wrong footfall ends not just your own night, but possibly everyone's. There is no clever trick that makes a minefield safe. There is only patience, care, and nerve, applied one agonizing step at a time. What the raiders did was as simple in concept as it was harrowing in practice. At the front of the long column moved a single man whose job was to find the mines before they found him, feeling his way forward and probing the sand ahead of him with a blade, easing the point gently into the ground to detect the buried menace before committing his weight, the way a careful person might test thin ice. Behind him, the rest of the force moved in single file, and here is the detail that tells you everything about the trust and discipline involved. Each man stepped precisely into the footprints of the man ahead of him, placing his own feet exactly where the lead man had already proven the ground to be safe, so that the entire column followed a single thread of cleared path winding through the buried death on either side. One careless step out of line, one moment of impatience or fatigue or fear that put a boot down in the wrong place, and the consequences would have been immediate and catastrophic for far more than the man who made the mistake. Spare a particular thought for the man at the very front, because his was perhaps the loneliest job in the entire operation. Everyone behind him at least had the small comfort of following a path that had already been proven, of placing their feet where someone else had survived placing his. The lead man had no such comfort. Every inch he cleared was ground that nobody had cleared before him, felt out by hand and by blade in total darkness, with no way of knowing whether the next probe of the sand would find nothing, or find the thing that ended everything. He had to work slowly enough to be sure and steadily enough to keep 40 men moving behind him, balancing 2 impossible demands while carrying the knowledge that the lives strung out in single file at his back depended entirely on the care of his own hands. It is a strange and terrible kind of responsibility, to be the thread on which so many other men hang, and to bear it not in the heat of a fight where adrenaline carries you, but in the cold, slow, methodical dark where there is nothing to do but concentrate and not make a mistake. The men who took the lead on jobs like this were a special breed even among an already remarkable group, and the success of the whole night rested first of all on the patient hands of whoever was out in front feeling for death in the sand. This is how they spent the better part of 3 hours. 3 hours of creeping forward at a pace that would test the patience of a saint. The lead man probing, the column following his exact path, every man acutely aware that the ground he was about to trust his life to had been cleared by feel in pitch darkness by the fellow in front of him. 3 hours of muscles cramping and nerves stretching and the simple, grinding mental effort of placing each foot with perfect care while a part of your mind insisted on calculating exactly what would happen if you got it wrong. It is hard to imagine a more complete test of an army's discipline, because there was no glory in this part, no enemy to fight, nothing to do but be patient and careful and trust, over and over, that the men around you would be patient and careful too. And they were. The whole force, all 40 of them, threaded that minefield in the dark without setting off the disaster that was waiting under every wrong step, which is the kind of achievement that gets overshadowed by what came after, but is in many ways the more astonishing feat. Meanwhile, up on their fortified height, the defenders of the post felt entirely secure, and you can hardly blame them. They sat behind a minefield, on commanding ground, in a strong position that had been giving them nothing but success as they directed fire down onto the garrison's vehicles. From their point of view, the mines did their job for them. No sane enemy was going to come at them across that buried ground in the dark, so there was no real need to be on edge. According to the way the night is remembered, some of them were passing the small hours the way bored soldiers everywhere have always passed them, settled in and playing cards, comfortable in the certainty that the minefield in front of them was an impassable wall. They were, in the most literal sense, holding a quiet game of cards on top of a position that several dozen extremely motivated men had just spent 3 hours silently crawling toward. It is the kind of scene that would be almost funny if you forgot for a moment how it was about to end. There is a particular agony in the last stretch of waiting that the raiders endured before they struck, and it deserves its due. Having crossed the minefield, the force did not simply burst straight into the position. They had to gather themselves at the very edge of it, in the dark, mere yards from an enemy who was talking and moving and entirely unaware, and hold there in absolute stillness, while every man got into place and the moment was judged exactly right. Imagine lying in the dirt close enough to hear the ordinary sounds of men at ease, the murmur of conversation, the small noises of a position at rest, after 3 hours of crawling through buried death to get there, with every nerve screaming for the waiting to be over and being required to do nothing, make no sound, betray nothing, until the signal came. The discipline of that final pause, the collective holding of breath by 40 men poised on the lip of action, was in its way as demanding as anything that had come before. The whole operation could still have been undone in those last seconds by a single cough, a single scrape of equipment, a single man whose nerve frayed a heartbeat too soon. That it held, that 40 men waited in perfect silence at arm's length from their unsuspecting enemy until the instant was exactly right, is the final proof of just how thoroughly this garrison had mastered the hardest discipline of all, which was the discipline of stillness. At around 3:45 in the morning, in the deepest, most defenceless trough of the night, the waiting ended. The raiding force, having completed its impossible crossing, and gathered itself in the dark at the edge of the position, rose as one and went over the parapet, and the shadows the besiegers had learned to dread poured into the post all at once. There is no good way to convey the speed and totality of that moment from the defenders' side, except to say that it must have felt less like a battle beginning than like reality itself suddenly malfunctioning. One instant the night was quiet. The minefield was doing its silent work. The position was secure. The next instant the enemy was simply there, inside the wire on the parapet among them, with no warning, no approaching noise, no shape glimpsed in the dark that might have given a second's notice. Everything the human mind relies on to brace for danger, the sound of an enemy drawing near, the sight of movement, the time to react, had been denied them by an approach so silent and so patient that it gave nothing away until it was complete. For men who had spent hours in comfortable certainty, the shock of that reversal would have been almost paralyzing in itself, and paralysis was exactly what the raiders had engineered. An enemy who cannot believe what is happening is an enemy who cannot organize a response, and the few seconds of pure disbelief the surprise brought were all the time the assault needed. For the defenders, the transformation from perfect security to total catastrophe took place in a span of time too short to react to. One moment they were safe behind their impassable minefield. The next, the enemy was inside the wire, inside the position, on top of them, having materialized from the one direction they had been certain was sealed. There was no time to man the defences properly, no time to bring their advantages to bear, no time to do much of anything except be overwhelmed by an assault that had arrived from inside their own assumptions. And then, with the position taken, the raiders faced the part of the night that the drama of the assault tends to push out of the picture, which was getting everyone and everything home again. They had reached the post by threading a minefield in single file over the course of 3 hours, and now they had to make the return trip, except this time burdened with prisoners who had to be controlled and kept quiet, carrying the captured documents and whatever else they had seized, managing their own wounded, and racing the slow lightening of the eastern sky that would strip away the darkness they depended on. Moving a cooperative, experienced raiding party silently through cleared ground is hard enough. Doing it while shepherding captured enemy soldiers, who had every reason to stumble or call out or simply move clumsily, across the same buried death they had just crossed, with dawn pressing in, was an ordeal of its own. That they brought it off, returning through the wire with their prisoners and their priceless haul, and the bulk of their own men intact, completed an operation that was very nearly flawless, from the first probing step into the minefield to the last man slipping back inside the perimeter as the night gave way. The position fell in minutes. A strong point that might have cost a great many lives to take by deliberate frontal assault, that the textbook said required a bombardment and a set-piece attack, was overrun almost before its defenders understood they were under attack at all. The enemy losses in the post were severe, running into the hundreds when the full reckoning was made, and a substantial number of prisoners were taken besides, men plucked from a position they had believed unassailable and marched off into the dark. The observation post that had been steadily bleeding the garrison of its trucks and crews was, in the space of a few minutes, simply gone as a threat, captured and cleared by men who had reached it through a method the enemy could neither anticipate nor counter. And then came the part that elevated this from a brilliant local success to something genuinely strategic, the part that earns this night its place as the one that changed the siege. Among the material captured in the overrun position were documents, and the documents turned out to be extraordinary. According to the intelligence officers who later went through the hall, the captured papers included maps and plans laying out the dispositions of the enemy's armour, the placement of the tanks across the besieging force, the kind of detailed picture of the opposing army that intelligence officers normally only dream about. In one night, a raiding party that had set out simply to silence a troublesome observation post had come back not only with prisoners and a captured position, but with what was assessed as the single most valuable intelligence haul of the entire siege. The garrison now had, handed to it in the dark, a window into where its enemy's most dangerous teeth were located, the sort of knowledge that shapes every decision a defending commander makes. A patrol meant to stop the loss of a few trucks had, almost by accident, delivered the keys to understanding the enemy's whole armoured strength. To appreciate why that was worth so much, you have to understand how starved commanders generally are for exactly this kind of information. War, at the level of generals and staffs, is largely a matter of trying to guess what the enemy has and where he has put it. Working from fragments, from aerial photographs that show only so much, from prisoners who know only their own small corner of things, from patterns and inference and a great deal of educated guesswork. To suddenly hold in your hands the enemy's own maps showing where his armour was concentrated is to have the fog lifted, briefly and precisely, from the most dangerous part of his force. Armour was the enemy's hammer, the thing that could break a defensive line if it fell in the wrong place, and knowing where that hammer was positioned meant the defenders could anticipate where a blow might come, weight their own defences accordingly, and stop reacting blindly to threats they could not see coming. A defending commander who knows where the enemy tanks are is a commander who can sleep a little better and plan a great deal smarter. That this windfall arrived not through some elaborate spy network but through a handful of riflemen overrunning an observation post in the dark is one of those accidents of war that looks, in hindsight, almost too convenient to be true. And yet, there it was, a strategic prize delivered by a tactical raid. Now sit with the full weight of what had just been accomplished, because the most remarkable thing about it is not the captured maps or the fallen position, or even the 3-hour minefield crossing. It is how it was all done. This entire operation, the elimination of a fortified strongpoint that had been a serious strategic problem, the capture of priceless intelligence, the seizure of prisoners, the infliction of heavy losses on the enemy, was achieved with almost no expenditure of ammunition at all. There was no bombardment. There was barely any gunfire. The raiders had not blasted their way to the objective with overwhelming firepower the way a conventional assault would have. They had reached it and taken it on the strength of 3 things and 3 things only: the darkness they had learned to move through, the silence they had learned to maintain, and the hard-won skill of men who had been hunting in the dark their whole lives. In an age increasingly defined by the roar of guns and engines and the industrial application of explosives, a small force of self-reliant bushmen had just won one of the most consequential actions of the siege, using essentially the same tools a hunter would have recognized 10,000 years ago, plus a great deal of nerve. And for a garrison cut off from resupply, that economy was not just elegant, it was practically a strategy in itself. Every shell not fired was a shell saved for a day when it might be desperately needed. Every operation that could be won by skill rather than firepower spared the fortress's finite, irreplaceable stores. A surrounded force cannot afford to fight expensively, and the raiders had found a way to inflict serious damage at almost no material cost at all, which for a besieged garrison is close to the ideal form of warfare. They were, in effect, getting strategic results on a shoestring, paying in courage and craft rather than in the precious supplies they could not replace. There is a hard logic in that which the conventional approach, for all its strengths, could never match, and it is one of the quieter reasons the method mattered so much to a fortress living perpetually on the edge of running out, where every choice ultimately came back to the same anxious arithmetic of what was left in the store. That is why this night sits at the heart of the whole story. It was the moment the method proved it could do more than annoy and unsettle the enemy, more than chip away at his confidence in the small hours. It proved that the approach Morshead had championed against all that resistance from above, the approach of trusting these supposedly undisciplined men to do what they did best, could deliver results of real strategic weight, could solve a problem that the conventional doctrine would have addressed only at far greater cost and with far less certainty. The staff officers who had wanted to do it the textbook way, with guns and a frontal assault, had been quietly and comprehensively shown a better path, one that spent skill and nerve where the textbook would have spent shells and lives, and the besiegers, who had thought a minefield and some high ground made them safe, had been taught once again the lesson they could never quite seem to absorb, which was that against this particular enemy, in this particular darkness, nothing was ever quite as safe as it looked. The ripple this sent through the besieging force was out of all proportion to the size of the action, and it worked on exactly the part of the mine that the small raids had already been steadily eroding. Up to this point, a defender on the line could at least tell himself that the worst of the night raiders were a danger to forward positions, to exposed sentries, to men caught in the open. A strong fortified post behind a minefield was supposed to be a different category of thing, a place where you could feel genuinely secure. The loss of exactly such a position, taken in minutes by men who had crossed the supposedly impassable mines without a sound, demolished that last comforting distinction. If that post could fall that way, then no position was truly safe, and a soldier who cannot convince himself that any place is safe is a soldier whose nerve is being attacked at its foundation. The besiegers had spent weeks learning to dread the dark in the abstract. Now they had concrete, undeniable proof that even their strongest points were not beyond the reach of the men who owned it. That kind of knowledge spreads, and it does not encourage anyone. It simply confirms, in the worst possible way, the slow conviction that had been settling over the whole besieging line, that when the sun went down the advantage went with it. And in coming off, that night shifted the balance of the whole siege. With that strong point silenced, and the constant slaughter of the supply vehicles eased, the immediate crisis that had launched the raid was over. But it pointed straight back at the deeper question that had been hanging over the whole fortress from the beginning, the question of supply itself. The trucks the raid had been protecting were only moving material that had to reach the fortress somehow in the first place, and a surrounded garrison cut off by land does not refill its stores of food, water, ammunition and fuel out of thin air. All of it had to come in across the one route the besiegers could not fully close, and keeping that route open was a struggle every bit as desperate and every bit as costly as anything happening out beyond the wire, fought not by bushmen in the dark but by sailors on a sea that the enemy controlled from the air. That is the next thread of this story, and it is one that the legend of the night raids has long unfairly overshadowed. For all the brilliance of what happened out beyond the wire, none of it would have been possible if the fortress had simply run out of the means to fight, and a besieged garrison is always, in the end, racing against its own empty shelves. The men who kept those shelves from emptying did their fighting in a very different place and a very different way, and they paid for it just as dearly. A fortress, in the end, is only as strong as its larder, and this is the part of the story that almost never gets told, because it is not nearly as cinematic as shadows rising out of the sand. Nobody made the men who kept the garrison alive into a legend, partly because what they did happened far from the wire out on the dark water, and partly because their work was the unglamorous, essential, deeply terrifying business of hauling supplies into a place that the enemy was doing everything in his power to seal off. But without them, every brilliant thing that happened inside the perimeter would have ended in a matter of weeks, because courage and cunning are wonderful things and absolutely useless when you have run out of bullets, water, and food. So let us finally give the supply line its due, because the way the fortress was fed is, in its own quiet way, just as remarkable as anything that happened in the night raids. Start with the brutal geography of the problem, which we have circled before but now need to look at from the opposite direction. As established early on, the fortress sat with the open sea at its back and the besieging ring sealing it off on every landward side. For the enemy, that ring meant the place could not be relieved by land. For the garrison, it meant something even starker, that every single thing the defenders needed to keep fighting had to arrive across that one open avenue, the water, because there was simply no other way in. The roads were cut. The desert was the enemy's. The only door left unlocked was the sea, and even that door the besiegers were straining every nerve to slam shut. A surrounded force does not get to pop out to resupply. It eats what it has, and it lives or dies on whether anyone can get more of it through the gap. This is where the Navy enters the story, and specifically the long-suffering ships and crews who took on the job of running that gap night after night for the better part of a year. The garrison needed a constant stream of incoming material, ammunition above all, because a defensive battle burns through it at a frightening rate, and water, which in that climate was not a comfort but a matter of bare survival, and food, and fuel, and replacement weapons, and fresh troops to relieve the exhausted ones. And it needed all of that flowing in one direction while a steady stream of traffic moved the other way, carrying out the wounded who could not be properly treated inside the fortress, the prisoners taken in the raids, and the men who had simply reached the end of what any human being could endure. It was, in effect, a shuttle service, a ferry, running back and forth across a stretch of water to keep a besieged community supplied and connected to the outside world. The trouble was that this particular ferry route ran straight through some of the most dangerous water in the world at that moment, and the men who crewed it knew it. The vessels pressed into this work were a mixed and sometimes improbable fleet, ranging from sleek warships to humble little craft that had never been designed for anything of the sort. The fastest and most prized of the runners were the destroyers, which is where the operation reveals one of its quiet absurdities, because a destroyer is an expensive, heavily armed warship built for hunting submarines and screening fleets, and here they were being used as high-speed delivery vans for crates of ammunition and sacks of food. It is a bit like hiring a race car to do your weekly grocery shopping, except that the race car was also being shot at. But destroyers had the one quality that mattered most on this route, which was speed, the ability to dash in, unload, and be gone again before the dawn and the aircraft caught up with them, and so they were used in a role that would have horrified the people who designed them. Alongside them ran smaller warships and a whole assortment of lesser craft, sloops and gunboats and small supply vessels, and flat little barges and lighters that crept along carrying the bulkier loads the fast ships could not be spared for. It was not a tidy, purpose-built supply operation. It was a scratch fleet of whatever could float and move, bent to a task none of it had been intended for, which is a fairly good summary of how the whole defence of the fortress was run. And the men who crewed these vessels were a similarly mixed bunch, professional sailors of the regular navy alongside the crews of merchant ships and smaller craft, all of them improvising a way to do a job that no peacetime training had ever quite prepared them for, learning the route's particular dangers the hard way, and passing that knowledge along to whoever came next. There was no manual for running a besieged fortress's lifeline through enemy-controlled water in the dark, so they wrote one as they went, in the most expensive way imaginable. The reason it all had to happen in darkness brings us to the single greatest threat hanging over the whole operation, which was the enemy air force. During the daylight hours, the skies over the approaches to the fortress and over the harbour itself belonged more or less to the enemy. Aircraft could spot a ship from a great distance, swoop in, and attack it with bombs, and a ship caught in open water in daylight with hostile aircraft overhead was a ship in very serious trouble. There was nowhere to hide on the surface of the sea, so the runs were made at night, the ships timing their voyages to arrive, unload, and depart under cover of darkness, racing to be far away again before the dawn brought the aircraft back. It was the maritime equivalent of the same logic that governed the night raids, the deliberate use of darkness to neutralize an enemy advantage, except that here the stakes were measured in entire ships and their crews rather than in patrols. A ferry that can only run in the dark against the clock, through waters the enemy is actively trying to close, is not a comfortable way to keep a fortress alive, but it was the only way available, so it was the way it was done. Picture a single run to understand what the crews actually faced, because the abstract danger becomes a great deal more real when you break it down into its stages. A ship would set out so as to make the dangerous approach in darkness, running fast through waters it knew were watched and mined, every man aboard aware that the most exposed part of the night was still to come. Then came the harbour itself, and the frantic against-the-clock business of unloading, which was its own special ordeal. There was no leisurely docking here. The cargo had to come off and the return cargo had to go on with desperate speed, because every minute the ship sat in the harbour was a minute it was a stationary target in the most dangerous water on the route, and dawn was always coming. Men worked at a furious pace in the dark to shift ammunition and stores and water, to load the wounded and the outgoing troops, to turn the ship around and get it moving again before the light betrayed them, and then the run back out, racing the sunrise, knowing that to be caught in open water as the sky lightened was to invite exactly the attack the whole timetable existed to avoid. The entire operation was a sprint conducted in darkness, with a deadline made of daybreak, repeated night after night, and the margin for delay was measured in the difference between getting home and not. The sailors, being sailors, gave the whole grim enterprise the kind of names that only men doing something genuinely awful would invent, names that wrapped the danger in a layer of dry, self-mocking humour. They called the operation the Tobruk Ferry, which is a wonderfully understated thing to call one of the most hazardous shipping runs of the entire war, as though they were popping across a calm harbour to the other side rather than running a gauntlet of bombs and mines in the dark. The word ferry conjures something safe and routine, a sleepy crossing with a snack bar, and applying it to this was exactly the kind of joke men make when the alternative is thinking too hard about the odds. They also called it the Spud Run, spud being the homely old word for a potato, partly because food was among the cargo, and partly, one suspects, because there is something irresistibly deflating about reducing a terrifying military operation to the level of a vegetable delivery. It is hard to feel too grand about the danger when you have decided to call your suicide-adjacent shipping route the potato shuttle. That instinct to puncture fear with a bit of plain humour is one of the oldest survival mechanisms soldiers and sailors have, and it ran all through this operation. There is a sad irony buried in the fact that this work, for all its danger, never became the stuff of legend the way the night raids did, and the reason says something about how we remember war in general. The raiders had everything a legend needs. They had a vivid, almost mythic image, shadows rising from the sand, and a clear human drama of small bands of men outwitting a mighty enemy in the dark. Their deeds could be pictured, retold, dramatized. The work of the supply crews had none of that. It happened far out on the black water where nobody could see it. It consisted largely of the deeply unphotogenic business of moving boxes very fast in the dark, and its heroism was the quiet, cumulative kind that does not lend itself to a single thrilling scene. A man hauling crates of ammunition across the deck of a ship racing the dawn is not an image that fires the imagination the way a blackened-faced raider does, even though he was very possibly in more danger. So the sailors got the harder, less survivable job, and the smaller share of the glory, which is roughly the opposite of how a just universe would arrange things, and they got on with it anyway. If there is a lesson in that, it is that the parts of any great effort that get remembered are rarely the same as the parts that did the most to make it possible, and the truly indispensable work is often the work nobody can see. But the names should not fool anyone, least of all us, because the reality behind the jokes was savage. Running the gap was deadly, repeatedly and predictably deadly, and the Navy paid for keeping the fortress alive in the hardest currency there is. Ships were caught and sunk, crews were lost. The enemy aircraft did not stop trying simply because the ships moved at night, and a vessel could be caught at the most vulnerable moments, on the approach, while unloading in the harbour, or on the way back out as the light began to threaten. Beyond the bombs there were mines in the water, and the simple, constant peril of operating ships at speed in darkness through confined and dangerous waters. Over the long months of the siege the toll mounted steadily, a sloop here, a destroyer there, small craft and their crews swallowed by the same dark sea that was the fortress's only lifeline. The men who ran the ferry knew, every time they set out, that this run might be the one that did not come back, and they made it anyway, again and again, because the men inside the wire could not last a week without them. What makes that steady acceptance of risk so striking is that the danger never relented and never improved. This was not a matter of running a dangerous gauntlet once and being done with it. It was the same deadly trip, over and over, for months on end, with the odds quietly stacking up against anyone who made enough runs. A soldier in a battle at least has the grim consolation that the battle will eventually end. The crews of the ferry had no such horizon. As long as the fortress held, the runs had to continue, which meant the men who crewed them were signing up not for a single brush with death, but for an open-ended series of them, each one an independent roll of the dice. The enemy adapted, watched the routes, sowed mines, kept his aircraft hunting, and the loss of ships was not a one-off tragedy, but a slow, continuous attrition. A steady subtraction of vessels and crews that everyone involved could see happening, and nobody could stop. To keep volunteering to make a run you have watched others not return from night after night, with no end in sight, is a particular and underrated form of courage. The kind that does not come with a charge and a battle cry, but with the quiet decision to do the frightening thing again because it still needs doing. The harbour they were running to became, over time, a grim monument to the cost of the whole enterprise. So many ships had been sunk in and around it that the water itself was littered with wrecks, the masts and superstructures of sunken vessels jutting up out of the sea, the hulks of bombed ships resting where they had gone down. Bringing a ship into that harbour in the dark meant threading a path between the bones of the ships that had come before, a navigational challenge that would have been daunting in broad daylight and was nerve-shredding at night, under threat of attack against the clock. It was less a harbour in the ordinary sense than a half-flooded graveyard that the living ships had to share with the dead ones, and every wreck was a reminder of exactly what was at stake on each run. There is a particular kind of courage in sailing calmly into a place like that, knowing what every one of those protruding masts represented, and doing your job, and the men who did it deserve a great deal more remembrance than they have generally received. For the men inside the wire, the arrival of a successful run was about far more than the crates it brought. A ship that made it through carried, along with the ammunition and the water, the intangible things a besieged garrison hungers for almost as badly as it hungers for supplies. It carried mail from home, the letters that reminded men cut off in the desert that there was still a world out there that loved them and was waiting for them. It carried news of how the wider war was going, scraps of the bigger picture for men whose own horizon had shrunk to a stretch of wire and a patch of sky. It carried, simply by arriving, the reassurance that they had not been forgotten or abandoned, that someone out there was still willing to risk ships and lives to keep them alive. That reassurance was worth a great deal to morale, perhaps more than the planners ever fully measured, because the worst enemy of a surrounded garrison is not always hunger or thirst, but the creeping fear that the outside world has written it off. Every ship that slipped in through the dark and the wrecks was a quiet answer to that fear, a tangible promise that the lifeline still held, and the men on it still cared enough to keep coming. The ferry, in other words, did not only feed the body of the fortress, it fed its spirit, and a besieged force needs both fed if it is going to last. The remarkable thing, given how hard the enemy tried and how much the runs cost, is that the gap was never actually closed. The besiegers threw aircraft, mines, and every other tool they had at the sea route, and they extracted a painful toll, but they never managed to choke it off completely, never managed to starve the fortress into the surrender that a sealed lifeline would have forced. This was not for lack of effort on their part, and it was not luck on the part of the defenders. It was the product of a deliberate decision, made at the highest levels, that keeping the fortress supplied was worth whatever it cost, and a corresponding willingness on the part of the Navy to keep paying that cost run after run. There is a cold strategic logic to it that is worth appreciating. As long as the fortress held, it pinned down a large part of the enemy's strength and threatened his whole position, which we will come to shortly, and that benefit was judged to be worth the price in ships and men required to keep it alive. So the runs continued, the losses were absorbed, and the door the enemy strained so hard to slam shut stayed stubbornly, expensively open. The fortress lived because someone decided it would live, and then paid for that decision in installments, night after night, out on the dark water. And the ferry did not only carry cargo, it carried people in both directions, and this is where we come to one of the most important and most frequently overlooked truths of the entire siege, the one that quietly corrects the tidy legend we have been building. Among the incoming cargo, one item deserves particular mention, because it sat at the very top of the list of things the fortress could not do without, and it was not ammunition or fuel, it was water. In that climate, as we have touched on, water was not a comfort but the thin line between an army that could function and one that simply could not, and the fortress could never produce enough of its own to meet its needs. So a substantial part of what the ferry hauled in, night after night, was the most basic substance imaginable. The stuff that comes free out of a tap in any ordinary life, carried across a deadly stretch of sea at the cost of ships and men, because without it, the whole position would have withered within days. There is something quietly staggering in the thought of warships running a gauntlet of bombs to deliver drinking water, But that is exactly the kind of priority a siege imposes. The most sophisticated weapon is useless held by a man who cannot get a drink, and the enemy knew it as well as the defenders did, which is precisely why closing that sea route was worth so much effort to him. The traffic the other way was, if anything, even more affecting. The ferry carried out the men the fortress could no longer care for or no longer needed to keep, and chief among them were the wounded. A besieged position can do only so much for a badly hurt man, and the chance of proper treatment lay outside, across the water, which meant that the same dangerous runs that brought in the means of fighting carried out its human cost. Men who had been hurt holding the line, now making the perilous voyage in the hope of reaching a hospital that could do more for them than a dugout under fire ever could. Alongside them went the prisoners taken in the raids, removed to secure captivity far from the front, and the men who had simply been worn past the point of usefulness by the unrelenting strain of the place. Every run, in other words, was both a delivery and an evacuation, threading the same needle of darkness in both directions, and the cargo in the holds was a running ledger of everything the siege demanded and everything it cost. Because the popular image of this story, the one that the focus on the night raiders tends to reinforce, is of a single body of men, the Australians, holding the fortress alone from beginning to end against all the odds, a fixed and unchanging garrison of heroes. It is a stirring picture. It is also not quite accurate, and the inaccuracy matters, because the truth is both more complicated and, in its own way, more impressive. The men who held the fortress were not a static group. Over the long months of the siege, the garrison was rotated, with units brought out for relief and fresh units brought in to take their place, all of it moving along that same dangerous sea route under cover of darkness. And as that process unfolded, the composition of the defending force changed substantially. The Australian division that had borne the brunt of the early fighting, that had pioneered the night raids and broken the great armoured assault, was for the most part eventually relieved and withdrawn, brought out by sea over a series of difficult and costly operations. Their place was taken by other troops, most notably a British division, the 71st, which moved in to hold the line, and a brigade of Polish soldiers, the Carpathian Brigade, men who had made their own extraordinary journeys to end up fighting in a North African desert, and who took up their share of the perimeter with great determination. The fortress in its later months was held by a genuinely international cast, a mix of nationalities sharing the same wire, the same danger, and the same stubborn refusal to give up the position. The Polish soldiers in particular had a story behind them that gives you some sense of just how far the threads of that war reached. These were men whose own country had been overrun and occupied early in the conflict, who had refused to accept that the fight was over, and who had made long and often extraordinary journeys across half the world to keep fighting wherever they could. By the time they took up their stretch of the desert perimeter, they had already travelled a road most of us can scarcely imagine, driven by the determination to strike back at the enemy who had taken their homeland. They brought to the fortress a ferocity and a resolve that came from having a very personal stake in the outcome, and they held their part of the line with a tenacity that earned the respect of everyone around them. The British division that came in to take over the bulk of the defence, for its part, was a regular formation doing the unglamorous essential work of relieving exhausted men and keeping a hard-won position in Allied hands. None of these troops feature much in the popular telling, which tends to freeze the garrison at its most famous early composition, but they carried the siege through long stretches of its later course, and the place held on their watch just as it had held on the watch of the men they replaced. This does not diminish the Australians in the slightest, and it is worth being clear about that. The reasons for the relief were largely political and practical, rather than any failure on the part of the men, having to do with decisions made far above the level of the fortress about where particular national forces ought to be deployed, and concerns about the strain of an indefinite siege on the troops who had been there longest. And the relief itself was no simple matter, since moving thousands of men out and thousands more in, all by night, all through that contested water, was an enormous and dangerous undertaking in its own right. In fact, the process was not even fully completed. The dangers of the sea route and the pressures of the wider war meant that some Australian units could not be extracted as planned and remained in the fortress right through to the end of the siege, fighting alongside the British and Polish and other troops who had come to share the burden. So even the relief was partial, a tangled, interrupted affair shaped by the same brutal constraints that governed everything else about the place. It is worth dwelling for a moment on just how enormous and dangerous the relief operation itself was. because it is easy to say the garrison was rotated and move on, as though that were a simple administrative matter. It was nothing of the sort. Swapping out the defenders of a besieged fortress means moving thousands of men in one direction and thousands in the other, and every one of those men had to make the same perilous sea crossing that the supplies did, in the dark, through the contested water, aboard ships that were prime targets. An incoming unit had to be landed and brought up to the line, and an outgoing unit had to be pulled off the line and embarked, all without weakening the perimeter at any moment, all on a tight nocturnal schedule, all under the threat of attack. It was a delicate piece of choreography conducted under the worst possible conditions, and the fact that it was attempted at all repeatedly tells you how seriously the burden on the longest-serving troops was taken. When the dangers of the route and the demands of the wider war finally interrupted the process and left some men unable to be extracted, it was not through carelessness, but because the sea simply would not always permit what the planners intended. The water had the final say, as it had the final say over everything that moved to and from the fortress, and sometimes its answer was no. Acknowledging all of this is not a footnote or a technicality. It is essential to understanding what the defence of the fortress actually was, because the simple version, the lone band of Australians holding out in complete isolation, quietly erases the contributions of a great many other men who held that line and bled for it, and it erases entirely the sailors without whom none of them, of any nationality, could have lasted a month. The fortress did not hold because of one group of supermen. It held because of a system, a fragile and constantly endangered system, in which infantry of several nations manned the perimeter. Gunners stood to their weapons, and behind all of them, out on the black water, the crews of the ferry kept the whole thing fed and supplied and connected to the world, at a cost in ships and lives that is easy to overlook precisely because it happened out of sight. Living inside that system meant living with a low, constant hum of anxiety that the men on the wire and the men running the ships shared without often speaking of it. The awareness that the whole position rested on a supply line that could fail at any time. A run lost meant supplies that did not arrive, and supplies that did not arrive meant a fortress edging a little closer to the day its shelves ran empty. Everything was rationed, weighed, counted, and stretched, because a besieged garrison cannot simply order more of what it lacks. It lives within the hard limits of what the ferry can bring, and the ferry lives within the hard limits of what the dark and the dangerous water will allow. This is the unglamorous accounting that underlies every siege, the patient, grinding mathematics of how much comes in against how much is used up, and it governs the fate of fortresses far more reliably than the drama of any single battle. The defenders could win every fight on the perimeter and still lose the siege if the sum of supply ever fell short of the sum of need. That it never quite did, across all those months, was the achievement of the ferry, and it was an achievement measured not in glory but in the simple, vital fact that the fortress never ran out. There is a tendency, in the way these stories get told and retold, to compress and simplify until all the inconvenient complexity has been squeezed out and what remains is a clean, satisfying myth. The myth here would have it that 14,000 or so Australians stood entirely alone against the might of the enemy, and prevailed through sheer fighting spirit. The reality is richer than that, and, properly understood, more admirable, not less. The garrison was sustained by a lifeline that the enemy never quite managed to sever despite enormous effort, manned by sailors who ran a deadly shuttle through dangerous waters night after night and paid for it dearly. The perimeter was held, especially in the later stages, by a coalition of troops from different nations who do not feature in the popular image at all, and the Australians who get all the credit, deserving as they are of an enormous amount of it, were themselves part of a larger, messier, more interdependent effort than the tidy legend allows. Recognising that does not take anything away from the men who blackened their faces and crawled out into the dark. It simply places them where they actually belong, as one brilliant and important part of a much bigger story that involved a great many other people doing dangerous, unglamorous, indispensable work. What ties the whole thing together, the raiders in the dark and the gunners in the daylight and the sailors out on the black water, is a single thread that runs through every part of it, which is that the fortress survived on the willingness of ordinary people to do extraordinarily dangerous jobs over and over without much fuss and without much recognition, because the jobs needed doing. The sailor making yet another run through the gap was, in his own way, doing the same thing as the rifleman crawling out toward an enemy post, accepting a frightening risk as the simple price of keeping the position alive. Neither could have managed without the other. The most daring raid in the world is pointless if the men who carried it out starve the following week, and all the supplies in the world are pointless if the perimeter caves in. It took every piece working together, the spear and the shaft and the long, dark, dangerous supply line that kept both of them sharp, and the moment any one of those pieces failed, the whole thing would have come apart. So when the legend of the fortress is told, and it deserves to be told, it ought to make room for the potato shuttle and its understated, terrible courage, for the harbour full of wrecks, for the British and Polish and other soldiers who shared the wire, and for the simple, complicating truth that holding out was a team effort, on a scale the tidy version never captures. The men in the dark with their blackened faces earned every bit of their fame, but they would be the first to tell you, in their flat and unsentimental way, that they could not have done a single thing without the ships that fed them, and that the line they defended was, in the end, held by far more hands than the legend remembers. And with the fortress fed, the perimeter held, and the enemy's great assault thrown back, the real measure of what all this stubbornness had achieved was beginning to show up in the one place that matters most in war, which is the cold arithmetic of what it was costing the other side. Numbers in the end tell a story that no legend can embellish, and no propaganda can hide, and the numbers that came out of this siege were strange enough to make even the most confident enemy commander stop and reconsider everything he thought he knew about the men he had trapped. War, stripped of its drama and its flags, eventually comes down to bookkeeping, and the books on this siege told a story so strange that they are worth lingering over, because they reveal something the heroics alone cannot. The figures that have come down to us, the ones that became the backbone of the whole legend, point to a single startling fact, which is that holding a particular stretch of the line against this garrison was vastly more expensive for the besiegers than holding the line anywhere else. And nothing exposes the truth of a military situation quite like the cost of it, measured not in stirring speeches but in the dry, undeniable language of losses. The pattern that emerged over the months of the siege was unmistakable to anyone looking at the casualty returns. On the sectors where the besiegers faced more conventional opponents, the losses were what a besieging army grimly expects, the ordinary attrition of a static front. But on the stretch held by the Australians, the cost ran far higher, multiplying out of all proportion to what was happening elsewhere around the perimeter. The same besieging army, with the same weapons and the same training, bled at a dramatically faster rate on this one section of front than on any other, and the only variable that had changed was the identity and the methods of the men on the other side of the wire. When one stretch of your line is costing you several times what the rest of it costs, and the only difference is who is opposite you, you do not need to be a brilliant analyst to work out where your problem lies. This kind of lopsided ledger does something corrosive to a command that goes well beyond the raw loss of men. An army runs on the confidence of its officers that they understand their situation, that the numbers more or less make sense, that effort produces predictable results. A sector that bleeds at several times the normal rate, for no reason the staff can fully explain or fix, violates that sense of order and quietly undermines it. The officers responsible for that stretch of line had to file their returns knowing they would be questioned, knowing the figures made them look as though they were failing, and knowing there was very little they could actually do to bring the numbers down. That is a demoralizing position for any commander, to be held accountable for losses you cannot prevent against an enemy you cannot pin down, and it works its way up the chain. A senior commander reviewing his casualty reports and seeing one sector consistently hemorrhaging men is a commander whose attention, time, and worry are being monopolized by a problem that should, on paper, have been minor. The garrison was not just killing and capturing the enemy. It was consuming the enemy's command attention, forcing his best minds to keep circling back to a problem they could not put down, and that diversion of focus was a cost that never showed up in any casualty column, but mattered enormously all the same. What the besieging commander did about that problem is the detail that turns this from a story of local annoyance into something close to historical comedy, except that it actually happened, and it actually mattered. Faced with losses he could not sustain on that sector, with observation posts being overrun and forward positions being bled white night after night, the celebrated general who had chased entire armies across the desert made a decision that must have galled him to his core. He pulled back. He ordered his forward positions on the Australian sector withdrawn, shifting them a couple of kilometres to the rear, abandoning the close-in observation posts and the advanced ground simply to get his men out of the reach of the raiders. In other words, the besieger retreated from the besieged. The man doing the surrounding gave up ground to the men he had supposedly trapped, conceding territory not because he had been driven from it in a great battle, but because holding it that close to the wire had become more than he was willing to pay for. Sit with the sheer absurdity of that for a moment, because it inverts everything we think we understand about a siege. The entire logic of surrounding a fortress is that you are the cat, and the trapped garrison is the mouse. You hold the initiative, you choose when to press, and the people inside the wire spend their days dreading what you might do next. That is how it is supposed to work. What happened here turned that relationship completely on its head. It was the besieging army that came to dread the dark, the besieging army that pulled its positions back to a safer distance, the besieging army that found itself reacting to its supposedly helpless prisoners, rather than the other way around. The men locked inside the fortress were behaving like the aggressors, dictating the terms of engagement, pushing the enemy backward, while the famous commander outside was reduced to managing a problem he could not solve and quietly ceding ground to make it more bearable. It is one of the more remarkable role reversals in the whole history of siege warfare, a situation where the question of who exactly was besieging whom became genuinely difficult to answer. For the commander personally, the decision to pull back must have been bitter, in a way that went beyond mere tactics, because a general's authority rests in large part on his aura, on the belief among his own troops and his enemies that he advances and others retreat. This was a man whose entire reputation had been built on relentless forward motion, on never giving ground, on always being the one pressing the attack. To order a withdrawal, however local, however sensible, against an enemy he had surrounded and was supposed to be crushing, was to chip at that aura with his own hand. His own soldiers would have understood exactly what it meant when the word came down to abandon the forward positions and fall back to a safer distance. It meant that the men in the fortress had won that particular contest, that the dark belonged to them, that even the great commander had concluded the close ground was not worth holding against them. There is no way to dress up a retreat from a trapped enemy as anything other than a concession, and a concession from a man like that, made for reasons of pure cost rather than any larger plan, was a quiet admission that on this one sector, against these one set of men, his usual magic simply did not work. Commanders remember defeats like that, the small humiliating ones that no grand narrative can absorb, and they tend to gnaw at the confidence in ways that a clean loss in open battle somehow does not. When you add up what the garrison accomplished over the full span of the siege, the cumulative picture explains how it came to that. The siege ran for something on the order of 240 days, the better part of a year, an extraordinary length of time to hold a surrounded position against a determined enemy. Across those long months, by the figures that have become part of the record, the Australian division mounted somewhere in the region of 96 separate raids out beyond the wire, which works out to a steady, relentless drumbeat of aggression, night after night, week after week, never letting the besiegers settle, never allowing the darkness to become safe. Those raids and the fighting around them yielded thousands of prisoners taken from the enemy, a steady stream of men removed from the besieging force and marched off into captivity, and the destruction of well over 100 pieces of the enemy's equipment, the tanks and vehicles and weapons that an army cannot easily replace at the end of a long supply line. None of these numbers is the kind of thing that wins a war in a single dramatic stroke. They are the numbers of a slow, grinding, cumulative bleeding, and added together over the better part of a year they describe a garrison that did far more than survive. It went on the offensive and stayed there, turning a defensive siege into a prolonged campaign of attrition that it was, against all expectation, winning. It helps to translate those raw figures into what they actually meant on the ground, because a number like 96 raids can wash over you without registering. Spread across the months of the siege, that is a raid every few nights, sustained without let-up for the better part of a year, which means the besiegers never got more than a handful of quiet nights in a row before the pressure returned. There was no period of respite long enough to relax into, no stretch where the threat faded enough to be forgotten. The thousands of prisoners taken represent not just a loss of manpower, but a steady, demoralizing trickle of men who simply vanished from their posts, each disappearance a small reminder to those left behind that they could be next. And the destruction of more than 100 pieces of equipment carried a weight far heavier than the number suggests, because at the end of that long supply line, every tank, every vehicle, every gun was painfully difficult to replace. A piece of equipment lost in the desert was not quickly made good the way it might have been closer to home. It was simply gone, subtracted permanently from a force that could not easily afford the loss. The cumulative effect was an enemy worn down not in one great blow, but in 1,000 small cuts, each individually survivable, all of them together adding up to a steady erosion of strength and equipment and morale that no besieging army could comfortably absorb. A word of honesty is owed here about these figures, because the line between history and legend gets blurry around numbers like these, and it would be wrong to pretend otherwise. Precise accounting in the middle of a long siege is difficult at the best of times, and the totals that have come down to us have been shaped by retelling, by the natural tendency of a good story to round upward, and by the simple fact that both sides had reasons to count things in ways that suited them. So the exact figures should be held a little loosely, treated as the shape of the truth rather than its precise measurement. But here is the important point. Even if you discount the numbers generously, even if you assume the legend has inflated them in the telling, the underlying reality does not change. The casualty imbalance was real enough to provoke a real withdrawal of the enemy's line, which is the kind of evidence that does not lie, because no commander pulls his positions back from a trapped enemy over an imaginary problem. The garrison really did tie down a force larger than itself, really did mount a relentless campaign of raids, and really did make one stretch of front cost far more than the rest. The precise digits may be fuzzy, but the thing the digits describe is solid, and it is solid because it left marks in places that cannot be exaggerated away, in conceded ground and abandoned posts and a famous commander forced to change his behaviour. But the single most important number of the entire siege is not about prisoners or destroyed tanks or the count of raids. It is about something larger and more strategic, and it is the number that explains why the whole stubborn enterprise mattered to the war as a whole rather than just to the men involved in it. The garrison numbered something like 14,000 men at its core, a modest force by the standards of the campaigns being fought across that theatre. And that modest force, by simply existing and refusing to be dislodged, tied down a substantially larger body of the enemy, on the order of 19,000 German and Italian troops, who had to be committed to containing the fortress rather than being used anywhere else. That is the entire strategic point distilled into a single comparison. Those 19,000 enemy soldiers, with all their weapons and equipment, were pinned in place around the perimeter, unable to do the one thing their commander desperately wanted them to do, which was to drive east toward Egypt and the great prize beyond. A force smaller than itself was holding a force larger than itself completely out of the decisive theatre, and every day the fortress held was a day those enemy troops spent guarding a position instead of advancing on the objective that might have changed the whole course of the campaign. This is what military thinkers mean when they talk about an economy of force, the art of using a small commitment to neutralize a much larger one, and it is one of the most valuable things a relatively weak force can achieve. The fortress did not need to defeat the besieging army outright. It only needed to keep it occupied, to be such an intractable, painful, unignorable problem that the enemy could not afford to look away from it, and in that it succeeded completely. The drive on Egypt that the commander had been so eager to launch was delayed and weakened, because a chunk of the force he needed for it was stuck babysitting a fortress that would not die. You could make a serious argument that the men crawling out into the dark with blackened faces, who thought of their work as simply a difficult job that needed doing, were quietly shaping the outcome of the entire desert war, not by any single victory but by the cumulative weight of refusing to lose, month after month, and forcing the enemy to keep paying attention to them when his attention was needed elsewhere. The beauty of an economy of force, when it works, is how disproportionate the return can be on a relatively small investment. Think of it in the plainest terms. A modest garrison, by the simple act of holding on, removed from the enemy's available strength a body of troops larger than itself, and not just any troops, but ones the enemy needed badly for the offensive he most wanted to launch. Every soldier committed to the besieging ring was a soldier who could not be sent forward toward the great objective, and the fortress, just by existing, kept a substantial slice of the enemy's army frozen in place, doing nothing more productive than watching a perimeter. It is a remarkably efficient way to fight, if you can stand the strain of being the bait, because you are spending relatively little to deny the enemy a great deal. The men inside were not winning the war by destroying the enemy outright, which they could never have done with their numbers. They were winning a piece of it by being so impossible to ignore that the enemy had to keep spending his strength on them, strength he could have used to perhaps decisive effect somewhere else. In the grand accounting of a campaign, a force that ties down more than its own number of the enemy, and keeps them out of the decisive theatre has more than earned its keep, even if it never fires a shot in the battles that ultimately decide things. Now here is where the larger comparison comes into focus, the one that gives this whole story its sharpest point, because the obvious question is why this particular force, on this particular stretch of line, generated a kind of fear and a kind of result that other Allied forces did not. The Australians were not the only soldiers fighting the same enemy in that theatre, nor the only brave ones, and it would be both unfair and inaccurate to suggest otherwise. As the war in North Africa wore on, the conflict was decided in large part by other forces using very different methods. The army that eventually turned the tide and drove the enemy out of the region, the one that won the great decisive battles, fought in a thoroughly conventional way, and so did the American troops who arrived to join the campaign later. Their approach was the orthodox one, the very approach the textbook recommended and that the fortress's commander had so often declined to use. They fought by daylight, in large set-piece battles, leaning on overwhelming firepower, massed artillery bombardments, and the methodical application of superior material to break prepared enemy positions. And it is important to be clear that this conventional approach was not inferior, and it certainly was not cowardly. It worked. It won the campaign and, in the end, the war. The great set-piece battles fought with massed guns and daylight assaults shattered the enemy and drove him out of the region for good, which is more than any number of night raids could ever have achieved on their own. The men who fought that way were every bit as brave as the raiders. Charging into the teeth of prepared defences under the open sky takes a courage that needs no defending, and their method was suited to the task they faced, which was not to hold a surrounded fortress but to attack and destroy an enemy army in the open field. Different problems call for different solutions, and the problem of breaking a defending army across a broad front genuinely does demand the kind of firepower-heavy, daylight combined arms approach that those forces brought to bear. There is no shame whatsoever in fighting that way, and a great deal of the credit for winning the war belongs to the men who did. It is worth understanding why the conventional method was not just acceptable, but actually correct for the job it faced, because dismissing it would be both unfair and wrong. When you are the one trying to break a well-prepared enemy who is dug in across a wide front, stealth and night raids will not get you very far. You cannot infiltrate your way through a deeply fortified line held in strength. At some point you have to physically break the position, push the enemy out of carefully prepared defences, and seize the ground, and that requires bringing overwhelming force to bear at the decisive point. The massed artillery that the orthodox approach relied on was not a failure of imagination. It was the right tool for smashing fortifications and suppressing defenders so that attacking infantry and armour stood a chance of getting across the deadly open ground. The set-piece battle, carefully planned, heavily supported and delivered in daylight so that all the moving parts could be coordinated, was how you destroyed an enemy army in the field, and the night raid simply could not do that job. A handful of men slipping through the dark can unsettle a besieging line and bleed it slowly, but they cannot break a defended front and drive an army out of a country. For that you need the hammer, and the forces that wielded the hammer were doing exactly what their situation demanded. The two methods were not really competitors. They were answers to entirely different questions, and the mistake would be to imagine that because one suited a besieged fortress, it would have suited an offensive campaign, or the other way around. But there was a cost to that way of fighting, and it showed up in the casualty lists. The orthodox approach, for all its effectiveness, tended to be expensive in lives, because attacking a prepared enemy in daylight behind a bombardment means accepting that a great many of your men will fall in the assault, that you will trade lives for ground in the brutal currency of the frontal attack. It was a method that spent men to achieve its results, and it achieved great results, but the price was high. The raiders had stumbled onto something different, a way of inflicting damage and exerting pressure that spent skill and nerve and darkness instead of lives and shells, and while it could never have won the war by itself, it achieved a particular kind of result that the conventional method, for all its power, could not. It got inside the enemy's head in a way that a bombardment never did. You can brace yourself against an artillery barrage. You cannot brace yourself against a fear that has no schedule and no shape, and that is the difference that the casualty figures alone do not fully capture. Which brings us to the heart of the comparison, and to the answer to the question that this whole story has been circling from the very beginning. Why did the enemy come to fear this one force in a way he did not fear others, even others who hit him harder and ultimately beat him? The answer is not that the Australians were braver. because courage was not in short supply on any side of this war, and the men who made the great daylight assaults were as brave as anyone who ever lived. And the answer is not that the Australians had better weapons, because they were, if anything, more lightly armed than the forces that eventually won the campaign, fighting with blades and entrenching tools and hoarded ammunition, while others rolled forward behind walls of artillery. The difference was none of those things. The difference was the approach itself, the way of thinking about the problem, the decision to fight a kind of war the enemy was not prepared for and could not counter. The forces that fought conventionally, however effectively, fought the enemy on terms the enemy understood. A daylight battle with massed artillery was a fight the German army knew intimately, had trained for, had fought 100 times. It might lose such a battle badly, but it never found such a battle bewildering or unnatural or frightening in the particular way that the night raids were frightening. The enemy could respect a conventional opponent, could fear his guns and his numbers, but he understood him. There is a real and underappreciated difference between those two kinds of fear, and it is the key to the whole comparison. The fear a soldier feels facing a massed artillery barrage is enormous, but it is a comprehensible fear. He knows what is happening to him, knows roughly what to expect, knows that if he keeps his head down and rides it out he has a chance, and knows that when it lifts the immediate danger has passed. It is terrible, but it fits inside his understanding of the world. The fear the raiders produced was a different animal entirely, because it attacked not just the body, but the soldier's sense of how reality was supposed to work. An enemy who comes at you in a way your training never prepared you for, who ignores the boundaries everyone is supposed to respect, who turns the things that should make you safe into the very things that get you killed, produces a fear that has nowhere to settle. It is the difference between being afraid of a strong opponent and being afraid of something you cannot categorize at all. A soldier can make his peace, after a fashion, with the first. The second eats at him precisely because he cannot fit it into any framework that would let him manage it. The conventional forces, however hard they hit in ways the enemy could file under known and dangerous. The raiders hit in ways he could only file under wrong, and a threat that feels wrong is far harder to live with than one that merely feels deadly. The raiders he did not understand, and that was the whole point. They refused to fight the war he knew. They took his assumptions about how soldiers behave and quietly discarded them. They turned his strengths into irrelevancies and his certainties into liabilities, and they did it not with superior force but with a superior willingness to fight in a way nobody had given them permission to fight. That is what got under his skin, what made him pull his positions back, what made him give an entire stretch of front the kind of paranoid, costly special treatment he reserved for nothing else. It was not the strength of the hand, but the strangeness of the mind behind it, the same conclusion we reached watching the fear take hold, now confirmed in the cold ledger of casualties and conceded ground. It is worth asking why, if this approach was so effective, more armies did not simply adopt it, and the answer reveals something uncomfortable about how military institutions actually work. The truth is that the very things that made this method possible are things most armies actively train out of their soldiers. A conventional army values uniformity, obedience, and predictability, because those qualities make large bodies of men controllable and reliable, and on the whole that is a reasonable thing to want. But the same system that produces a disciplined, controllable soldier tends to suppress exactly the independence, improvisation, and comfort with operating alone that the raids depended on. You cannot easily order a man to be a self-reliant hunter. Either he is one, formed by a life that made him one, or he is not, and no amount of drill will conjure the instinct from nothing. The garrison's commander did not create these qualities in his men. He inherited them, recognized them, and had the unusual wisdom to build a method around them rather than grinding them away as most of his peers would have. That combination, the right raw material and a leader willing to use it against the grain of conventional doctrine, is genuinely rare, which is precisely why this kind of warfare shows up so seldom and is remembered so vividly when it does. Most armies, faced with the same situation, would have done the textbook thing, sat behind the wire and endured, because that is what their structure and their training pushed them toward. It took an unusual set of men and an unusual commander to do otherwise, and the rarity of that combination is a large part of why the story is worth telling at all. There is a gentle irony in this that should not be missed. The qualities the British establishment had sneered at, the slouching, the backtalk, the refusal to be impressed by rank, were the surface expression of exactly the independence that made the whole method possible. Had these men been more biddable, more conventionally disciplined, more like the model soldiers their critics wished they were, they would very likely have been less effective, not more. The army that took the time to tidy them up would have filed away the one quality that made them dangerous. It is a useful reminder that the traits which annoy an institution and the traits which make someone genuinely good at a hard job are not always the same traits, and are sometimes very nearly opposites. The men who were too undisciplined to salute properly were, it turned out, disciplined in the only way that mattered out in the dark, and the gap between those two kinds of discipline is the whole misunderstanding in a single sentence. What remains is to follow that difference out of the desert and into the decades that came after, to see where this strange way of fighting went once the siege was lifted and the men went home. Because a method this effective does not simply vanish when the guns fall silent. Ideas that work in war have a way of being noticed, studied, copied, and absorbed, and the strange craft these men perfected out beyond the wire turned out to have a long afterlife, reaching into the training of soldiers who would not be born until long after the last shot of this siege was fired. The men themselves would scatter back to their farms and their towns and say very little about what they had done, but the way they had done it had already begun its quiet journey into the doctrine of armies that had every reason to pay attention. And there is one more thing to settle before we close, which is the matter of the name the enemy's own propaganda accidentally handed these men, a name meant as an insult that they seized and wore with enormous pride, and how a scornful nickname became one of the most honoured titles a soldier of that nation could claim. The name that stuck to these men, the one history remembers them by, was never meant as a compliment. It was an insult, manufactured and broadcast by the enemy's own propaganda machine, designed to belittle and demoralize, and it backfired so completely that it became one of the proudest titles a soldier of that nation could carry. The story of how that happened is the perfect note to end on, because it captures in miniature everything these men were. It began on the airwaves. The enemy ran an English-language propaganda service aimed at Allied troops and the people back home, the sort of broadcast meant to spread doubt and despair, fronted by an announcer who became infamous under the mocking nickname Lord Haw-Haw, a jeering voice that delighted in painting Allied prospects in the gloomiest possible terms. At some point this propaganda turned its attention to the besieged fortress and reached for an image meant to humiliate the men trapped inside it. It described them as rats, cornered creatures caught in a hole in the ground, scurrying about underground in their dugouts, while the great enemy army prepared to exterminate them. The intent was obvious, and not especially subtle. Rats are vermin, frightened and contemptible, things you trap and destroy, and the message to the garrison was that this was all they were, helpless animals awaiting their inevitable end. It was meant to make them feel small, doomed, and despised. This kind of broadcast was a standard tool of the era, a recognized form of warfare aimed not at the body but at the mind. The idea was that if you could make enemy soldiers feel isolated, hopeless, and forgotten, if you could convince them their cause was lost and their leaders had abandoned them, you might soften their will to fight before a shot was even exchanged. It was, in its way, a perfectly sensible strategy, and against some audiences it surely had an effect. The trouble, as the propagandists were about to discover, is that psychological warfare only works if you understand the psychology of your target, and reaching for a contemptuous animal image to break the spirit of men who had spent their lives among animals and hard country was a bit like trying to insult a fisherman by calling him wet. The whole effort depended on the men inside the fortress sharing the broadcaster's assumption that being compared to a rat was shameful. They did not share that assumption even slightly, and so the carefully aimed insult sailed straight past its target and landed, to the propagandist's eventual horror, as a gift. Now, if the propagandists had known the first thing about the men they were trying to insult, they would have chosen literally any other animal, because calling this particular group of soldiers rats was a catastrophic misjudgment of their character. These were men with a deep, almost reflexive instinct to take whatever the world threw at them and throw it right back with a grin, men whose whole culture was built on a cheerful refusal to be impressed by anyone trying to look down on them. So instead of being wounded by the insult, they were delighted by it. They seized the name with both hands, adopted it instantly and gleefully, and began calling themselves the Rats of Tobruk with enormous pride. The enemy had tried to brand them as cornered vermin, and the men had effectively replied, "Yes, exactly, and we are going to make that the most feared name in the desert." There is a particular kind of person who, when called a rat by someone trying to frighten him, decides that being a rat sounds rather good actually, and the fortress was full of exactly that kind of person. What is striking is how completely and how durably the name took hold, because this was not a passing joke that faded once the war moved on. The men carried it for the rest of their lives, and it became the permanent, honoured identity of everyone who had served in that siege. In the decades that followed, the survivors organised themselves under that very name, gathering as the Rats of Tobruk, marching under it, memorialising their fallen under it, passing it down to their children and grandchildren as a thing to be proud of rather than a wound to be forgotten. A label cooked up in a propaganda studio to humiliate a trapped garrison became, through the simple alchemy of the men's own attitude, one of the most respected honorifics in their nation's military memory. There are not many examples in history of an enemy's insult being so thoroughly captured, turned around and worn as a crown, and the fact that it endured for generations is the proof that the men meant it. They were not just making a defiant gesture in the heat of the siege. They genuinely decided that this was who they were, and they never let go of it. They did not stop at simply adopting the name either, because that would not have been nearly cheeky enough. They turned it into an emblem, and in doing so they produced one of the great pieces of improvised defiance of the whole war. With the same self-reliant make-do instinct that had taught them to crew abandoned guns and cross minefields by feel, the men set about making themselves badges and informal decorations bearing the image of a rat, often a grinning, jaunty, distinctly unapologetic rat, the very opposite of the cowering vermin the propaganda had intended. And here is the detail that elevates it from amusing to magnificent. They frequently made these little emblems out of scraps of metal salvaged from wrecked and downed enemy aircraft and equipment, fashioning the symbol of their pride from the literal debris of the army that had tried to destroy them. Think about the layered insolence of that. The enemy calls you a rat to break your spirit. You adopt the name with delight, fashion a cheeky rat badge to wear it openly, and you build that badge out of pieces of the enemy's own broken machines. It is hard to imagine a more complete reversal of an intended insult, a more perfect distillation of the spirit that had made these men so impossible to defeat. The propaganda meant to crush their morale had instead handed them a rallying symbol that they wore for the rest of their lives. The craftsmanship that went into these homemade emblems is worth picturing, because it tells you something about both the men and the conditions. There was nothing official about them, no quartermaster issuing neat regulation badges. These were do-it-yourself creations, cut and shaped and hammered out by hand from whatever metal could be scavenged, each one a little different, bearing the personal stamp of whoever had made it. Some were cruder, some were surprisingly fine, depending on the skill and patience of the maker, and they were traded, gifted and worn with the pride of something earned rather than handed out. In a place where men had very little and could acquire almost nothing, the effort that went into fashioning these small symbols speaks to how much they meant. A man does not spend his scarce free time and scarcer materials making a badge for something he is ashamed of. He makes it for something he wants the world to know he was part of. That instinct, to turn the debris of a siege into a token of belonging, is the same resourceful, defiant, faintly mischievous spirit that had defined everything these men did, now applied to the gentle art of giving the enemy's propaganda a permanent and very personal raspberry. That spirit, the refusal to be diminished, the instinct to turn an attack into a joke and a joke into a badge of honour, was the same thing that had run through every part of their story, simply expressed one last time in the realm of names and symbols rather than raids and defences. It is of a piece with everything we have seen, the same temperament that argued with officers, ignored the parts of the rulebook it found silly, and decided that the deadliest ground on the battlefield was a fine place to go hunting. The enemy had reached for the most demeaning image he could think of, and the men had calmly informed him that they would be keeping it, thank you, and wearing it with pride. You cannot demoralize people like that. You can only annoy them into becoming even more themselves. If there is a lesson in that for the would-be propagandist, it is that mockery only works on people who are afraid of being mocked, and aiming contempt at men who have made a lifestyle out of not caring what their betters think is a fool's errand. The broadcast had been an exercise in trying to lower the garrison's opinion of itself, and it ran headlong into the awkward reality that these men's opinion of themselves was both unshakable and entirely indifferent to the views of a sneering voice on the radio. The harder the propaganda pushed, the more it simply confirmed what the men already believed, which was that they were getting under the enemy's skin badly enough to be worth a broadcast. Being insulted by an enemy you are clearly tormenting is, After all, a backhanded form of flattery, and they took it exactly that way. The whole episode stands as a small, perfect illustration of why psychological warfare is so much harder than it looks. You cannot reach into another person's sense of who they are and rearrange it from the outside, least of all when that person finds the whole attempt hilarious. But the legacy of these men reaches far beyond a defiant nickname and a homemade badge, and this is the part that lifts the whole story out of the realm of colourful anecdote and into something genuinely consequential. Because the way they had fought, the method they had perfected out beyond the wire, did not die when the siege was lifted and the men dispersed. It was noticed. Professional soldiers, the kind who study past conflicts for a living, looked at what had been achieved on that perimeter and recognized that something important had happened there, something worth understanding and learning from. In the years that followed the war, the techniques the garrison had developed found their way into the serious study of warfare, examined and dissected in the military academies and officer training establishments of the major powers, from the institutions of one allied capital to another. What a group of supposedly undisciplined colonials had worked out by instinct and necessity in the desert became, in time, the subject of formal professional analysis. The forces that paid the closest attention were precisely the ones whose business was this kind of fighting, the elite units built specifically for raiding, infiltration, and operating in small groups behind or against the enemy. The commandos, the rangers, the various special operations forces that would proliferate during and after the war and become a permanent feature of every serious military, all drew on the same well of principles that the garrison had demonstrated so effectively. The emphasis on absolute silence and stealth over firepower, the careful management of the approach, including that crucial business of closing to exactly the right distance before striking, neither too far nor too near, the deliberate exploitation of darkness and the enemy's exhaustion, and above all the understanding that the psychological effect of these methods, the fear and uncertainty they bred in an opponent, could be a weapon every bit as powerful as anything that fired a bullet. These were the lessons the garrison had paid for in the desert, and they became foundational principles for the kind of soldier whose job is to do a great deal of damage with very few men in the dark. The lineage runs surprisingly straight from that desert perimeter to the elite formations of today, the units that slip in by night, strike with precision, and are gone before the enemy can respond. They train for years to do deliberately and reliably what these men did by instinct, and while they would not necessarily put it this way, they are in a real sense the professional descendants of a band of stockmen and hunters who proved on one stretch of contested ground just how much a few skilled, silent, fearless people could accomplish against an enemy who never saw them coming. It is a strange kind of inheritance, passed not by blood or by any formal institution, but by example, the proof of a concept handed down from men who would have been baffled to learn they had founded anything at all. It is worth being specific about what those inherited principles actually were, because they are not vague generalities but concrete, teachable techniques, and they remain recognizable in the way elite forces operate to this day. There is the foundational idea that a small, highly trained group can achieve effects out of all proportion to its size, provided it fights on its own terms rather than the enemy's. There is the discipline of the approach, the patient, silent movement that values not being seen above almost everything else, and the hard-won understanding that the final distance before a strike has to be judged with precision. There is the principle of attacking the enemy when and where he is weakest rather than where he is strongest, of exploiting the hours of fatigue and the gaps in alertness rather than throwing yourself against prepared defences. There is the careful preparation, the rehearsal, the obsessive attention to detail that turns a dangerous improvisation into a repeatable craft. And running through all of it is the recognition that the goal is not merely to inflict physical damage, but to dominate the enemy's mind, to make him afraid, uncertain, and exhausted, to win the battle inside his head before you ever close with him. Every one of those ideas is now standard in the training of the world's special operations forces, and every one of them was demonstrated in its essentials by men who had never read a word of doctrine and were simply doing what came naturally. It goes deeper still, because the influence did not stop with the formal special forces of the regular armies. The broader principles these men had embodied, the power of the small, mobile, irregular force that refuses to meet a stronger enemy on his own terms and instead fights him in the ways he is least prepared for, turned out to be principles that the unconventional and guerrilla conflicts of the later 20th century would arrive at again and again. The whole logic of asymmetric warfare, of the weaker side declining the set-piece battle it cannot win, and instead bleeding a stronger enemy through stealth, surprise, harassment, and psychological pressure, is in its essence the same logic the garrison had stumbled onto out of necessity. They had not invented irregular warfare, which is as old as conflict itself, but they had demonstrated in a particularly clear and well-documented way just how devastatingly effective it could be even against one of the most formidable conventional armies in existence. The bushmen who hunted in the dark because hunting in the dark was what they knew had, without intending to, provided a kind of masterclass in a way of fighting that would echo through the rest of the century. You can trace the same essential logic through a great many of the conflicts that came after, even ones that look, on the surface, entirely unconnected to a desert siege. Wherever a smaller, weaker, or more lightly equipped force has found itself facing a stronger conventional enemy, and chosen not to oblige that enemy with the kind of stand-up battle he was built to win, the underlying principle has been the same one the garrison demonstrated. Refuse the fight the enemy wants. Make him fight the fight he hates. Use stealth, surprise, patience, mobility, and intimate knowledge of the ground to bleed him slowly and to attack the one thing his firepower cannot protect, which is his confidence and his peace of mind. Time and again through the latter half of the 20th century, conventional armies with overwhelming material superiority found themselves frustrated, exhausted, and eventually worn down by opponents who simply would not stand still and be destroyed, who melted away when pressed and reappeared where least expected, and who understood that the will to keep fighting can be broken even when the body of an army cannot. None of those later fighters needed to have heard of the fortress to arrive at its lessons, because the lessons are the natural recourse of the weaker side in any age. But the garrison had shown, with unusual clarity, and against an unusually formidable enemy, just how far those methods could carry a force that had no business succeeding by conventional measures, and that demonstration was not lost on the people whose profession is the study of such things. There is a lovely irony buried in all of this that deserves to be drawn out. The method that ended up being taught in formal courses, codified into doctrine, and studied by professional soldiers in gleaming institutions, had originated with men who had no formal training in any of it whatsoever. It came not from a staff college or a manual, but from the practical wisdom of stockmen and hunters and prospectors, from lives spent reading country and moving quietly and surviving in hard places. The most sophisticated military establishments in the world ended up systematizing and teaching what a group of self-reliant amateurs had simply known in their bones. The instinct of the bush, the unschooled craft of people who had learned to hunt and track and endure because their livelihoods depended on it, was reverse-engineered into formal doctrine by professionals who recognized that these unlettered colonials had been doing something the academies had never quite captured. It is a reminder that genuine expertise does not always come wearing the right uniform or speaking the right language, and that the people who actually know how to do a difficult thing are not always the ones with the certificates to prove it. There is a broader truth in this that reaches well beyond soldiering, and it is one of the quiet lessons the whole story offers. We have a strong tendency to assume that knowledge worth having must come through official channels, that the expert is the person with the training and the title and the institutional stamp of approval, and that someone without those things cannot really know what he is doing. But the men of the fortress demonstrated in the most dramatic way imaginable that some of the most valuable knowledge in the world is the kind that is never written down, the kind that lives in the hands and instincts of people who have learned a hard skill by doing it for real over many years. Their expertise had been earned not in a classroom, but in the unforgiving school of a landscape that punished every mistake, and it turned out to be deeper and more reliable than anything the formal system could have given them. When the professionals finally got around to studying what these amateurs had done, they were not correcting the amateurs. They were learning from them, translating instinct into doctrine so that men without the benefit of such a hard upbringing could be taught to approximate what these men simply were. There is a humility worth absorbing in that, a recognition that the credential and the competence are not the same thing, and that the world is full of quiet people who know how to do remarkable things that no diploma will ever record. And what of the men themselves, the ones who had actually lived through those long nights and made all of this possible? The siege itself, after the better part of 8 months, finally came to its end the way these things usually do, not through the collapse of the defenders, but through the arrival of relief from outside. A major offensive was eventually launched to break through to the fortress, and after hard fighting, the besieging ring was broken open and the long ordeal lifted. The position that the enemy had been so confident of cracking in a matter of weeks had held from one season into another, outlasting his patience, his armoured assaults, and his propaganda, until the wider war finally swung back in its favour and the encirclement was undone. It was not a tidy storybook ending with trumpets and a single decisive moment. It was the gradual, grinding conclusion of a marathon of endurance, the fortress simply still standing when the tide came back in. But the essential fact was beyond dispute. The place had held. Everything the enemy had thrown at it, the armour and the artillery and the air power and the mockery, had failed to do the one thing that mattered, which was to take it. And when the survivors finally marched out, they did so not as a beaten garrison being released from a trap, but as men who had won a long and improbable contest and knew it. This is perhaps the most quietly affecting part of the whole story, and it is entirely in character. When the war ended and the survivors went home, they did not by and large become tellers of war stories. They did not write triumphant memoirs or hold forth at length about their exploits or trade endlessly on what they had done. Most of them simply went back to the lives they had left, back to the farms and the stations and the small towns, back to the cattle and the sheep and the ordinary hard work of the country that had made them what they were. They folded back into civilian life and largely kept their silence about the better part of 8 months they had spent owning the darkness on the far side of the world. The details of those nights, the things they had seen and done, they mostly carried quietly within themselves, sharing them sparingly if at all, taking the fullest knowledge of that strange and terrible chapter with them as they returned to ordinary lives and, in time, to their graves. There is no false modesty in that silence, and no trauma being denied either, just the plain unsentimental character of men who had always regarded the whole business as a difficult job that had needed doing rather than a glorious adventure to be recounted. They had approached the war the way they approached everything, with a flat practicality and a refusal to make too much of themselves, and they carried that same temperament home with them. The men who had so thoroughly unsettled one of the most feared armies on earth went back to worrying about rainfall and stock prices and the 1,000 mundane concerns of a working life. And if you had met one of them in a country town years later, you very likely would have had no idea that the quiet, weathered fellow across the counter had once been among the most genuinely frightening soldiers of his generation. That gap between the magnitude of what they had done and the modesty with which they carried it is, in its own way, the final and most fitting expression of who they were. It is tempting to wonder what it must have been like to hold both of those lives inside one person, to have been a figure of genuine dread to a great army, and then to spend 40 quiet years mending fences and worrying about the weather. The two seem almost impossible to reconcile. The silent hunter of the desert night and the unremarkable older man in a country town, and yet they were the same person, and the second grew naturally out of the first. The skills that had made them so dangerous, the patience, the self-reliance, the calm in the face of hardship were the very skills of an ordinary working life in hard country, simply turned for a few years toward a different and darker purpose before being turned back again. They had not been transformed into warriors and then forced to unlearn it. They had always been what they were, and the war had merely borrowed their nature for a while, so the homecoming was less a difficult readjustment than a quiet return to the default, the borrowed nature handed back, the men resuming the lives that had shaped them in the first place. And if they spoke little of the war, it was not because the memories were unbearable, but because to men of that temperament, talking at length about yourself has always been faintly embarrassing, and the work they had done out in the dark was in their own estimation simply work. The greatest compliment you could pay such a man, and the one he would have been most uncomfortable receiving, was to recognize that he never thought he deserved one. In the years and decades that followed, their nation came to remember them properly, even if they were reluctant to remember themselves out loud. The siege became one of the defining episodes of that country's wartime story, taught to school children, commemorated in ceremonies, carved into memorials, and woven into the national sense of who its people were and what they were capable of. The grinning rat that had begun as a hand-cut badge made from enemy scrap became an enduring emblem, instantly recognizable, a symbol of stubborn, irreverent, unbreakable defiance that meant a great deal to people who had never been within 1,000 miles of that desert. There is something fitting in the fact that the men who had been so casually dismissed by the establishment, the slouching colonials nobody expected anything from, ended up enshrined as a kind of ideal, the very embodiment of the qualities their own people most wanted to claim. The disdain of the early days curdled into pride, and the pride hardened into legend, and the legend, for once, was largely deserved. Not many groups of soldiers get to watch the insult thrown at them become the name on a monument, but these men did, and they earned every letter of it. It would be wrong, though, to let the cheerfulness of the legend obscure what it cost, because behind the grinning rat and the defiant good humour lies the plain fact that not everyone who went into that fortress came out of it. The long months of the siege took a steady toll, and a great many of the men who held that line, manned those guns, ran those ships, and crawled out into that darkness, did not live to wear the badge or return to the farm or grow into the quiet old men of the country towns. They were ordinary people, sons and brothers and husbands and fathers, who went to a distant desert and stayed there, and the legend they helped create was paid for in their lives as surely as in anyone's courage. The survivors who carried the name forward knew this better than anyone, which is part of why they wore it with such seriousness beneath the humour, because for them it was also a way of carrying the memory of the mates who had not made it home. Any honest telling of this story has to hold both things at once, the irreverent grin and the real grief underneath it, the triumph and the price. The men themselves managed to hold both, going quietly about their later lives while never quite forgetting the ones who stayed behind, and the least we can do, all these years later, is remember that the legend was built on real loss as much as on real defiance. So we come back at the very end to the question we started with, and the answer is now as clear as it is simple. Part of why this story has held its grip on people for so long, I suspect, is that it flatters something we badly want to believe, which is that cleverness and character can beat raw power, that the underdog who refuses to fight fair can topple the favourite, that being written off is not the same as being finished. History does not always cooperate with that hope, and plenty of brave, clever underdogs have been ground into the dust by stronger enemies who simply had more of everything. But every so often the hope is vindicated, and when it is, the example burns itself into memory precisely because it is the exception we were all rooting for. The fortress is one of those examples. It is the story of the people nobody believed in, fighting in the way nobody approved of, against the enemy nobody wanted to face, and coming out the other side having frightened that enemy more thoroughly than far stronger forces ever did. You do not have to be a soldier, or care about military history at all to feel the pull of that. It is the oldest and most satisfying shape a true story can take, and it happens to be true. We tell it not to glorify war, which deserves no glorifying, but because it reassures us that character still counts for something, in a world that often seems to reward only size and force, and because there is genuine comfort in knowing that the people written off as nothing can turn out to be the ones who matter most. The enemy did not fear these men because of their weapons, which were modest, nor because they were braver than anyone else, because courage was the common currency of that entire war. What the enemy feared was their thinking. They feared an opponent who looked at the rules everyone was supposed to follow and quietly decided those rules did not apply to him, who took every assumption about how soldiers behave and turned it inside out, who refused to fight the war he was expected to fight and instead fought one the enemy could neither understand nor counter. They turned what the world had dismissed as undisciplined into something the most powerful army of its day genuinely dreaded. That was the whole secret. Not better guns, not greater bravery, just a different and unbreakable way of seeing the problem, carried by men who had every reason to be beaten and simply declined to be. And that, I think, is where we will leave them, out in the dark where they were most at home, the grinning rats who turned an insult into a legend and a wild instinct into a way of war that outlived them all. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight and travelling all the way out to that distant desert and back. Now let those lights stay low, let your breathing slow, and let the quiet settle in. Sleep well, wherever you are, and may your dreams be gentle ones. Good night, and the sweetest of dreams to you all.